Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. I want to thank you for being here today, and I want to welcome you cordially to the first workshop at the National Institutes of Health on the new infectious disease, severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. Clearly, SARS represents not only a critical challenge to the public health community of the world, but it is also an extraordinary challenge to the research community. And I will speak to this a bit more in a few moments. But first, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce to you the Secretary of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'd like to thank you and CDC and, of course, Julie Gerberding and your colleagues for organizing this wonderful conference. But before I really thank you, I would really like to just point out what a great job all of you have done so far. And I certainly want to take this opportunity to thank all of the researchers from NIH, from CDC, from all the agencies here at the department, as well as from private industry and from other countries who have come to NIH today to attend this conference in person or by webcast. This challenge is big enough to keep all of us busy for a very long time. While I'm personally very concerned about SARS, I'm also extremely encouraged and very optimistic, Tony, about the response of the scientific community to this outbreak. It has been rapid, it's been skillful, and it has been amazingly successful. You have been able to identify the virus, you discovered it as a coronavirus, and you've learned so much more about it in a fraction of the time it used to take your predecessors. Your success so far has encouraged all of us that your continued success will be rapid and, more importantly, life-saving. The investment that taxpayers and investors have made in your research is definitely paying off. I follow your progress closely, and I will do everything I possibly can with the department's help to be able to help advance your mission. Just yesterday, I met with companies that make diagnostics to be able to review and encourage their progress in developing new tools for diagnosing SARS. I've also been meeting with vaccine and pharmaceutical manufacturers to encourage them to do everything they can to develop a vaccine or an antivirus drug. And even though SARS is new and we have a great deal to learn, I think it is absolutely wonderful that all of you have gathered today at NIH to share what you've learned so far and to be able to exchange ideas for what the next steps in SARS research ought to be. I am confident that you will learn much more about where the virus came from, how it spreads, what populations face the greatest risk, the best way to diagnose, treat, cure, and contain this awful virus, and what vaccines and antivirals, diagnostics, and protocols all of you can develop. I hope you'll leave today with an aggressive set of goals, timelines, and action items, and a good working relationship so you can continue to help each other effectively. The hopes and the prayers of many people and countries are with you as you meet and as you work. Best wishes for a great and a very successful conference.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and thank you very much for your extraordinary support over the years for your agencies in the Department of Health and Human Services. We truly appreciate it. I'm just going to take a very few moments to make some brief introductory remarks. First, I want to thank all of you, both the presenters and the many participants, in what I believe is going to be a very important meeting, certainly not the last meeting that we will have on this very important disease. I want to thank the members of my staff and a variety of other people involved who were tirelessly putting this meeting together in such a very, very short period of time, particularly John Montagne and his colleagues in the Office of the Director. We had some encouraging comments from people over the last several days about how extraordinary it was to put a meeting together in such a very brief period of time. Well, it was almost as fast as SARS spread, and I think that was the reason why we felt compelled to jump on this right from the very beginning. So we really appreciate it. I know all of you are so busy and have so many other responsibilities, and to, on such a short turnaround, come here and join us and help us in discussing the potential for a robust research agenda along with the other public health measures that are going to be essential to contain this epidemic, not only now, but in the future. So what I'd like to do, if I could have the first slide up. Thank you. As you see from this opening slide, one of the major purposes of the meeting, besides getting us here and providing a forum for networking with each other, although we are colleagues and talk to each other frequently, I think bringing us here today to discuss in a very intense manner what the real and the potential research response will be to this important public health threat. I just want to take a few moments to discuss something that is readily apparent to all of us. This is a slide that I frequently have used over the years in my testimonies before Congress on the topic of emerging and re-emerging threats. And it's one of those slides that interestingly requires almost continual update. And these are diseases over the past 20 years or so that have either emerged as brand new diseases, such as HIV/AIDS, have re-emerged in different places, in different forms, like the West Nile virus crisis that we have had in this country over the last 4 years. Every once in a while, you have a disease that when it does emerge, it has an extraordinary public health impact. Some are merely curiosities. They're very unfortunate for the very few individuals that the disease impacts, but they generally do not become a public health threat. And then every once in a while, you get something that in its reality and in its potential is an extraordinary public health threat. And we all know that that is what we are facing today with SARS. And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, it is not only a critical challenge to our public health, our global public health capabilities, but it is a very important and extraordinary challenge to the research community. It's extraordinary. We would not have imagined just a few months ago, when the first cases started trickling in and we could not figure out just what we were dealing with, that a few short months later, we would be seeing this on the cover of major national and international magazines. But the reality is that it is here and we need to deal with it. The people in this audience who I know have been closely following this epidemic do not need to be reminded of the impact here, which in a very brief period of time, an infection that started off in a remote province in China has now become a global epidemic, with the numbers for just a day and a half ago with over 8,000 cases and close to 800 deaths. And for those of you who had time on your way to this meeting to read the papers, you see on the front page that in countries in which we thought things were clearly very much in control, we're now starting to see a rebound phenomenon of cases in which the points of contact have not been able to be fully identified. So as many of us have been saying over the last couple of months, this is far from over with this episode and almost certainly will not disappear spontaneously. And so in this context, it is incumbent upon us to develop and execute not only an extraordinary public health endeavor, but also to probe as best we can and to establish a robust research agenda. This slide schematically diagrams the number of points of the research agenda that have already been pursued by us here at the NIH and certainly by a number of organizations worldwide. They range from the fundamental basic research, including pathogenesis in animal models, to the applied research that is already going on in the arena of vaccine development, drug screening, targeted drug development, thoughts about immune-based therapy, clinical research questions that can and should be asked and answered. So in this regard, the objectives of this meeting, this workshop, this colloquium, this opportunity for us to speak with each other, to network and to exchange ideas, is first to help develop a robust national research agenda for SARS, which by definition will really be a global research agenda, because we've learned from our interactions and our endeavors in other diseases that all of this will certainly be a global endeavor that will require many partners, academia, governments of many nations, industry, biotech companies, all of us working in synergy. We hope to identify gaps in our scientific understanding, and we also hope to identify and do something about those logistic and scientific barriers to the development of effective interventions. So it is in this spirit and in this context that I'd like to initiate and call to order this meeting. You know we have plenary sessions for the morning. I will chair and introduce the first component of the plenary sessions, and later in the morning, Dr. Montagne will take over for the second component. And then this afternoon, we have 5 breakout sessions, one devoted for vaccines, another for antivirals, another for clinical research, one for epidemiology, and one for diagnostics. So again, I want to welcome you and encourage you to participate actively in what should be a very exciting meeting. Let me now, right off, move on to introducing our first speaker, Klaus Storr. Dr. Storr serves officially as the project leader for the World Health Organization's Global Influenza Program in the Department of Communicable Disease Surveillance. And since February of this year, Klaus has also taken on the responsibility of the lead scientific coordinator of WHO's SARS outbreak response, and has been a key person in organizing the international collaborative teams which have served as an extraordinary model for us. Klaus, thank you for joining us today, and please come to the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you here. I would like to congratulate everyone who has been involved in the organization of this meeting. To me, it's the first meeting I'm participating, which is going to set a research agenda on SARS. It's the first meeting globally, which is bringing together everyone in the country, in the region, and many international scientists who have been involved in SARS surveillance, prevention, control, as well as science. Now, the meeting to me resembles a little in its design and the way we approach it, the way in which many of you have been collaborating in the past in surveillance and control of SARS outbreak. The success of this meeting will very much depend upon your enthusiasm, your dedication, will depend upon our decisiveness in dealing with this public health challenge. It will depend upon our capacity to perform and deliver under time pressure and to make decisions and not too many mistakes based on incomplete data. It's a great pleasure to WHO to be part of this meeting, to be invited to come, and it's an honor for us to be part of this global collaboration for SARS control, which in our view has been demonstrating how successful and important international partnership has been and will be in the future. I'm sure both SARS control as well as this meeting is going to be a success. Now, the presentation I would like to make comes from the WHO SARS team, and we are today at day X plus 76, which is the time which we have. Now, this is a map which is more than 1.5 months old. It shows how widespread SARS have been 6 weeks ago, how many countries were affected. This is a cumulative map on the number of probable cases. 6 weeks later, we are in a stage where we know where the epicenter is, where the number of cases has gone down, the number of affected countries is very small. But we are also seeing that certainly complacency can lead to the reemergence of this disease. For instance, in Taiwan, province of China, the number of cases has gone down to the single-digit numbers and is now back to the second largest outbreak which we have. Now, my screen is not showing anything here, so I have to look at this screen here. Just try once more if I can change that. Now I see something, you don't see anything. Oh, I think we're back now. Okay, but I cannot do in the next 20 minutes. I cannot cover the whole area of epidemiology. What I'm going to do, I'm going to skip virus excretion. Malik Paris is going to cover this, discrepancies between clinical and laboratory findings, virus stability, antibody kinetics, duration of immunity. The clinical presentation will cover the spectrum of illness. I will not touch upon superspreaders, co-infection, relapses, as well as effectiveness of intervention. So that's all I can talk about in the time available. These are aspects which I believe are very important and have to be considered, taken into account, and kept in one's mind when talking about the epidemiology, the etiology, as well as the clinical presentation of this disease. But again, there will be no time to discuss this now. But in the afternoon, I'm sure it's going to be brought up during the working group sessions. Now, there has been a lot of discussion when the outbreak began. We believe that the outbreak, or there are good indications that the outbreak did begin during the last quarter of 2002. Just a few data which we feel would point in that direction. In Hong Kong, there has been more than 300 blood sera tested for the presence of coronavirus antibodies. They were all negative. They were blood donor samples. 200 sera were tested in April, or actually in May, but the samples were taken in April. Another 500 are in the pipeline of testing. They were all negative for SARS corona antibodies. There have also been testing in the US, more than 400 sera prior to the SARS outbreak. They were all negative for SARS antibodies. There have been testing of nasopharyngeal swabs and other respiratory specimens from influenza surveillance in Canada, and in none of these specimens SARS coronavirus could be found. Now, a very interesting study has been concluded 2 weeks ago in Guangdong, jointly by colleagues from the Guangdong CDC, as well as the WHO team. And what these colleagues found was that in round about 30,000 cases of atypical pneumonia, round about 800 would fulfill the WHO case definition of SARS. And then they did a spatial and temporal analysis of these cases and could not find any clustering until the emergence of SARS in November last year. So that is a very strong indication that there has been no similar clustering of cases between 1999 and 2002 in that province until SARS, before SARS began. Now, the next slide should indicate a little bit on what we know about the occupational risk. The yellow bars indicate the number of cases per day reported in Hong Kong. These are probable cases. And on the right-hand side, the green line here indicates the percentage of healthcare workers per day, the rate of healthcare workers per day who were affected by the disease. You see that initially, round about 40 to 50% of all the cases occurred in healthcare workers. Then the community outbreak occurred with Emery Garden and the widespread transmission outside healthcare setting. And then when the control picked up, Then healthcare workers again made up a relatively large proportion of the reported probable cases. This indicates not only the level of risk healthcare workers are being exposed, but it also indicates how effective infectious control, identification of cases, isolation, treatment, follow-up of contacts can be, and the situation in Hong Kong has become quite stable now. What's the case fatality rate? It's estimated to be in the area of around about 15%. We started with 3 to 5%, very small sample size. We did not know at this stage how many people are going to be discharged. I put here on this chart on the right-hand side, the age-specific case fatality rate in China. And you see that round about 72% of all cases, death, occurs in individuals over 60. The figure for Canada is 83%. For Hong Kong, it's more than 50%. So age is definitely a risk factor without any doubts, as well as comorbidity. There has also been some indication that male are more likely to die from the disease than female. However, this gender difference certainly needs further investigation. It's being based on a relatively small number of cases in Hong Kong. What is interesting is that we still don't know what the influence of healthcare systems is on the outcome of the disease. What's the incubation period? This is data from 7 sites. Underneath, I put the number of cases which were included in that calculation, which had a single point exposure and could therefore be enrolled in these investigations. Most of the centers report a maximum incubation period, which is very important in terms of setting public health targets, looking at infectious control measures in hospital, discharge policies, contact quarantine duration. So 5 centers said this to 10 days. There are outliers here. These are 57 cases which were all Emery Garden cases, and there are also 5 outliers here from the Chinese data set. Most of the cases occur during the first 7 days after infection. Well, incubation period, most of the cases occur during these 7 days. These are data from China again, and it looks as if perhaps these outliers here might have been persons who may have had a second exposure, and it's not quite clear whether they had a single exposure. Though these data require certainly a detailed investigation before public health policy is going to be changed. Again, the current data are incubation period ranges between 2 to 10 days with a median of 5 days. This data is based on a single point exposure cases analysis, all well-defined exposure intervals from 7 sites. What is interesting is that we still do not know whether the route of infection has an influence on the incubation period. I'm not going to touch upon the excretion pattern, but would like to share briefly with you some extremes as far as RNA and virus excretion is concerned. This is data here from France. Virus RNA could be found up to and plus 32 days after onset of clinical signs. Data from Germany with the Singapore case, Hong Kong, 24 days, more than 49 days RNA excretion. One could find SARS RNA in tiers of a secondary case practically on day 1. Unfortunately, samples were not taken at a later stage. And as far as we know, the longest time virus could be isolated from a person was up to 16 days after onset of clinical signs. Now, what's the virus transmission pattern? There is first no evidence of transmission before onset of first symptoms. I'm not talking about excretion now, I'm talking about transmission. There were a few cases which are thought to have been transmitted in the early prodromal stage. That statement is being based on a relatively small number of cases from Canada and is currently being further investigated. We can also say that those who are very ill, who are experiencing rapid clinical deterioration, which is usually happening during the second week of the illness, are the most communicable. And there has been no evidence yet of transmission 10 days post-fever resolution. What are the routes of transmission? This has not changed in comparison to the very beginning of this outbreak. The primary mode of transmission is certainly direct mucous membrane contact with infectious respiratory droplets. We also know that events during which aerosolization of infectious material occurred in hospitals and other settings can certainly amplify transmission, and there have been quite a few examples, you know certainly all. The role of fecal oral transmission remains unknown, but Malik Paris will talk to you about excretion duration, about amount of virus which is excreted in feces and urine, and it's really considerable. And it's still unknown how this fecal oral transmission actually contributes to the maintenance of the outbreak and the propagation of the disease. What I would like to show you here just is also a little bit on occupational risk, but should show the attack rate in percent per occupational group. This is from one hospital in Vietnam. 53% of other staff with patient contacts the attack rate is 53% of other staff with patient contacts. It's the highest attack rate. It's not nurses, it's not doctors. It's in this group. What it tells us, there are very many hypotheses, but I believe that this may have also something to do with other ways of transmission than direct mucous membrane contact with infectious respiratory droplets. Contamination of materials and objects with X and secretions may certainly play a role in certain circumstances, certainly particularly in healthcare settings and closed environments. There has been no report so far on food or waterborne transmission. What are the routes of transmission? Cases occurred primarily in those in close contact with very ill in healthcare setting and households. Transmission to casual and social contacts has occasionally occurred. You also know the story of one lady sitting at a table with 7 colleagues in a Chinese restaurant, eating with them, and 4 of the contacts fell ill afterwards. You heard about students walking through wards and becoming infected, and there are many other of these anecdotal stories. A lot has to be further investigated, and there's room for research, I think, for the next months and years. There's no report of transmission to and between children. There's also no reports on vertical transmission from mother to child, as well as by blood and blood product. Briefly on SARS transmission on an airplane, there has been no transmission documented after 23rd of March. Until 23rd of March, there were 41 flights with probable cases. That led to 4 flights with a total of 25 secondary cases. Just a few words about asymptomatic excretors. We still don't know the complete spectrum of the disease. We have learned a lot, but it's still unclear how wide the spectrum is and what the spectrum depends upon. There is data from the Emory Garden cluster. There is one individual with seroconverted shed virus and RNA. There are 316 persons who were sampled respiratory specimen. 32 of them had a PCR positive specimen, respiratory specimen. 162 sera were taken from these quarantined person, and one of them seroconverted, asymptomatic, and virus or RNA could also be detected in the throat swab. There have been 2 cases reported from Canada. Evidently, no links to SARS patients or history of disease, and virus could be isolated. It's not PCR, it's a virus isolation from these 2 individuals. Again, there is no report on transmission from asymptomatic individuals. So excretion and transmission really has to be here clearly differentiated. We do also find seroconversion without disease. John Tum from the Prince of Wales Hospital is currently screening blood from, I think, 2,000 healthcare workers. 3 out of the 500 tested so far were positive by immunofluorescence assay. 2 of them had history of mild upper respiratory tract infection. We do have good data also from China, but we don't know how many healthcare workers were also found to have seroconverted without having developed or reportedly developed disease. You are also aware of the serological studies which have been conducted by Dr. Guanyi, Malik Pira's group, who are also here. They took blood from 10 wild animal traders from one live animal market, and 5 of these 10 seroconverted. That was found by immunofluorescence assay. There's also virus or RNA excretion without seroconversion, which is a very interesting phenomenon. There's only one report, to our knowledge, from the Hong Kong virus unit, Dr. Velina Lim. She had either 3 or 4 individuals which were PCR positive and did not seroconvert until day 32. Virus stability is going to be dealt with by Malik, I think. Very briefly on animal testing. Various animals were infected or exposed to the virus one way or the other in trials. In essence, what we can certainly say for the time being that none of them appeared to be an efficient host or reservoir for the disease. The only animal model which we have are non-human primates. The study from Rotterdam has been published in Nature already. There are non-human primate studies underway as far as we understand in US AMRED. The Chinese have started on the 13th of May with their monkey trials. And there are others ongoing, I think, also in the context of vaccine development. There have been also a few studies on rodents in France, China, also US. Now, these are anecdotal findings here, also from Amory Garden. 2 of 4 cats seroconverted. 1 was PCR positive. A dog was excreting RNA in its feces. Cockroaches could not be found as harboring the virus, at least not in their tissues, and rat droppings contained the virus. Now, as far as the animal reservoir is concerned, there will be a little bit of discussion certainly in the working group this afternoon, but you are aware that Guanyi and his group from Hong Kong, with his collaborators in Shenzhen, did find the SARS coronavirus in animals in Shenzhen, in various animal species, which of course then poses a question whether or not these animals are reservoir or transient carriers. We don't know how much they excrete, for how long they did seroconvert. We don't know which other animals would be positive. We're also unsure about the prevalence of infected or excreting viruses in other areas in southern China. What is complementary information is certainly that from that very market, 5 out of 10 wild animal handlers seroconverted. So that would also fit certainly into that picture. Which research would be necessary? This is a short list here, only for trying to focus on epidemiology. In brief, we believe that that more should be done to better understand what's the infectious period, what are the excretion patterns. That would be important for both infectious control as well as for the development of diagnostic tests. The positive predictive value of the test will very much depend upon what do we know about the excretion pattern of the virus in various specimens and body fluids. We still have an incomplete understanding of the route of transmission, what's the exposure dose, what's the infectious dose. We have little understanding on the comparative value and effectiveness of measures to prevent transmission. We know that countries are successful, but the comparative value and the contribution of the various measures to success is still needs to be investigated. Vertical transmission is incompletely understood. What role do children play? We know that they appear not to be important as far as case fatality is concerned in disease, but do they play a role in the transmission of the disease? The question of subclinical infection has to be further investigated. There are quite a number of studies ongoing, and we certainly need to go also more need to improve our understanding on animal and environmental reservoirs. I think if these aspects are going to be addressed, we will be able in the future to stop SARS from spreading and to improve further the maps which I have shown, which show that the epicenter is in one region of the world, and if we all work together collaboratively, and I consider this meeting to be part of it, we will certainly be in a position to control this disease. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. We will have time for questions and discussion of the entire group of 3 presenters when the 3rd presenter is finished. So if we could move on, I'd like to now take the opportunity to warmly welcome Dr. Malik Paris. Dr. Paris is a professor in the Department of Microbiology at the University of Hong Kong and is an expert in influenza epidemiology and pathogenesis, and has played an essential role in the identification of a coronavirus as the causative agent for SARS, and we're very pleased that he can be with us here today and join us from Hong Kong. Malik?
Thanks a lot, Dr. Fauci, and our thanks from Hong Kong for the invitation to speak at this important meeting. My task is to address the issues of etiology. And in addition to myself and Guani, who is here, I think we're talking on behalf of the WHO SARS laboratory network. Of course, they may not agree with everything I say, so I don't hold them responsible for some of the things I might say. This cartoon comes from nature, and clearly we are dealing with the first plague of the new millennium. I'm sure in the United States you have been anxious and concerned about SARS, but I think unless you lived in Hong Kong, for example, I don't think you could really have a feel for how devastating and what a great impact this disease has had in social terms, in economic terms, and possibly in political terms. So it has affected people's perceptions, and it has affected people's behavior. Klaus covered this. Looking at it from our own point of view, early in February, we had news, informal news coming in about an outbreak of unusual pneumonia in Guangdong. And our research group's main focus has been in influenza. So our first thought really was, could this be a pandemic influenza virus, particularly H5N1, which we have been working with. And therefore, we, together with our hospital authority in Hong Kong, heightened surveillance for severe atypical pneumonia across the hospital authority of Hong Kong. And also, 2 of my colleagues, Dr. Guan and Dr. Jen, went into Guangdong to try to establish contacts and get some additional information. Things are not all that easy, but so they undertook a pretty difficult job doing that. I'm sure you remember these incidents, the outbreak in Hanoi, outbreaks in Singapore and Canada, the healthcare workers in Hong Kong, the global alert on SARS, and the WHO network of laboratories working on SARS. And in regard to etiology, a number of laboratories which were linked together by the WHO network initiated by Klaus Storr, in fact, and WHO, pretty quickly established that influenza and other conventional respiratory viruses were not really responsible for this disease. I must point out that, in fact, in Hong Kong, one of the first things that we did come across was a cluster, a family of people with H5N1 associated with fatal pneumonia in one. And to some extent, that diverted us for a short period of time. But pretty quickly, it was obvious that this new problem that was going on in Guangdong was not due to influenza. So I think I'm now speaking for most of the labs that were handling this, decided to look at alternative approaches, looking at alternative viruses. And this just lists some of the approaches taken, using unconventional cell lines to grow the virus, consensus primers or low stringency PCR to pick up unknown viruses, random prime RT-PCR and differential display, EM on tissues where it was available, and certainly in the case of CDC, using array technology on isolated virus. But I guess, although we're talking about the 21st century, at the end of the day, the thing that did give us the clue really was the old tried and tested methods of trying to grow the virus. And as you know, independently, a number of groups came to the conclusion that a novel coronavirus was associated with SARS. So in our own case, we were using a monkey cell line, a fetal rhesus monkey cell line that is used to grow hepatitis A, in fact. It showed cytopathic effect. We could see virus in the cells, and in fact, after seeing the virus and looking back at the lung biopsy of one of these patients, we could actually see particles of similar size in the lung biopsy, and negative stain shows coronavirus-like particles. And using random PCR and differential display, one of my colleagues, Leo Poon, was able to fish out a fragment of the genome, which was 600 odd base pairs long, which indicated that it might be a novel coronavirus. In double quick time, as you well know, the full genome has been sequenced from two groups, CDC and the group in Vancouver. And looking at the whole genome does confirm that we are indeed looking at a novel coronavirus, not a recombinant of some sort. And the information from the genome has already been put into use in terms of antiviral drugs. For example, things like fusion peptide inhibitors and protease inhibitors are already being tested, and I'm sure this afternoon we'll hear about a number of other options that are coming out of the genetic information that has been generated. So how tight is the association between the coronavirus and this disease? This is two of our own cohorts of 107 patients with clinically defined SARS, and a very high proportion of them seroconvert to this virus. And metapneumovirus, which was something that was considered in the early part of this outbreak, at least in this cohort, outside the Prince of Wales Hospital, which clearly does have metapneumovirus co-infection. But outside that cohort, metapneumovirus does not seem to be playing a role. And paired sera from controls were negative, and blood donors were negative. This is in late March, early April. You can look at it in a different way. And this is now laboratory data from the 3 main labs in Hong Kong that are investigating SARS patients. And this is clinically confirmed SARS, more or less at the end of the time period of the patient being in hospital. That is the diagnosis that is given at discharge. And here, are patients who were investigated for suspected SARS, but finally, clinically was thought to have something else other than SARS. The control group are basically patients in hospital, but with no association with SARS as far as we know. But they're still hospital controls, except for this group here, which is actually a group of community controls, and these are throat swabs from healthy people, GP attendees in the community. And what you can see is a very tight association between, in those patients who have confirmed SARS, a very large proportion of them do seroconvert. And you can see in this group of other patients, again, investigated for suspected SARS, but thought not to be clinically, some of them, a small proportion of them, do seroconvert. In the control group, there's nothing. In RT-PCR, again, you do see a similar trend downwards here. And fulfilling Koch's postulates, you recall that requires, ideally, infection of a relevant animal model and isolating the virus from that animal model from sites of disease. And that has been fulfilled in cynomolgus macaques. You can see that some of the features of giant cells and severe interstitial pneumonia was reproduced in this model. So some of the questions that remained were the site and duration of virus shedding and infectivity, the stability of the virus in the environment, molecular evolution, in other words, how many lineages contributed to the Hong Kong outbreak, for example, the animal reservoir, amongst other things. So let me quickly go through some of these things. The site and duration of virus shedding so this is from our own laboratory and shows the detection by PCR in the nasopharyngeal aspirate in blue and the stool in red or maroon. I should mention, before I go on to this slide, that virus by PCR can be detected in the urine, although at less frequency, occasionally detected in the plasma, certainly can be detected in saliva, and has been detected in conjunctiva. So all those specimens are positive. But certainly from a clinical diagnostic point of view, nasopharyngeal aspirates, stool, and throat swabs are the most useful ones. But here this shows the percentage positivity at duration after onset. Now keep in mind, this is not a cohort that has been followed up. These are repeated cross-sectional samples over a large number of patients. So what you can see is that in the early part of the illness, you can find virus in the nasopharyngeal aspirate, but probably not in the stool, although the numbers of stool samples are not that great, but at a fairly low proportion. But by day 6, 7 onwards, this climbs up to a much higher proportion later on in the disease. And this is true for nasopharyngeal aspirates as well as for stool. The other important point is the duration of PCR positivity. And you can see that it clearly goes up, although it's falling after day 14 or so. It goes out to over 1 month. And as Klaus mentioned, the record goes beyond 42 days. Now, this is, of course, PCR positivity. It does not necessarily prove infectious virus by culture or infectivity. I think Klaus did mention that in terms of virus culture, we have cultured virus from nasopharyngeal aspirate and stool up to day 16. We really cannot say, hand on heart, that we cannot culture beyond here, because these specimens really are still being processed for culture. But day 16, in both specimens, the virus can be cultured. This is viral load in the nasopharyngeal aspirates from one cohort of patients in Amoy Gardens. And you can see that quantitatively, the amount of virus does go from lower levels to much higher levels, keeping in mind this is a logarithmic scale, around the beginning of the second week of the illness, and then it falls. So this, in effect, corroborates the previous slide that I showed you. And looking at virus quantitation, again by PCR in the stool, you again get a similar pattern. This is data from Dr. Lim in the Department of Health. Again, you get a similar pattern. So virus quantitatively increasing towards the end of the first week, beginning of the second week of illness. So some of the implications of these are that in terms of lab diagnosis, the problem is that the amount of virus that we are finding early in the disease, in the first few days of the disease, seems to be lower than later on in the disease. Now, this obviously is totally different to most other respiratory infections like flu or RSV, where you have maximal virus load at the onset of the disease. And I think this is one of the things that is posing challenges for diagnosis. The second thing it would imply is that transmission would be more likely in the later phases of the illness than very early in the illness, and that in fact seems to fit in with the epidata that is available. But I think that really needs to be firmed up with more solid epidata in future. Virus stability. This is again data from the WHO network of laboratories that put together, and clearly it was a bit of a surprise to us. First of all, it was a surprise to us to find the virus in the stool, and then it was a surprise to us to see that the virus was far more stable than is normally expected for respiratory coronaviruses or even for other respiratory viruses. So infectious virus by culture can survive for 1 to 2 days on surfaces at room temperature. The survival is longer on non-porous surfaces than on porous surfaces. And in the presence of organic matter, especially in alkaline pH, the stability of the virus seems to be markedly increased. It can certainly survive up to 4 days in feces of a pH of 8 or thereabouts. And I suppose, keeping in mind animal coronaviruses, there is certainly evidence that there can be you can have infectiousness and transmission for quite long periods of time in the environment. And this raises the question of the role of fomites in transmission, particularly in the healthcare setting. And I think this has probably not received as much attention as maybe it should. Coming to molecular epidemiology, we have looked at 47 odd patients from Hong Kong, sequencing the S1, S2 region, about 2,000 base pairs. And what this is showing is that patient 1 is the well-known index case in Hong Kong. And we find that 45 out of 47 viruses that we looked at, this is in early March, actually cluster together with this index case. There are two viruses from Hong Kong that are outside that, and then there are other viruses from Guangzhou, which were isolated by Dr. Guan, which again are outriders. So on a preliminary basis, this would suggest and would confirm, I suppose, the shoe-leather epidemiology, that the bulk of the early Hong Kong outbreak going all the way to Vietnam and Toronto and Singapore really comes from one clone or one cluster. I will just skip through that. I think the animal reservoir has been mentioned, and Dr. Guan will give a talk on this in the epidemiology session, so I will not dwell on that. I think there are some of the other questions that I did not put up there because I don't know the answers to them, but I think they're probably worth mentioning in terms of what needs to be done and what needs to be addressed. The issue of symptomatic versus asymptomatic disease, I think, is still very unclear. The role of cofactors in etiology is also not totally clear. Certainly in our cohorts, we have found evidence of other infections in small numbers of patients, and that includes metapneumovirus, influenza A, chlamydia pneumoniae, a number of things. But we really haven't gone back systematically to look at, for example, that large number of paired sero and seroconversions to see really how many of these co-infections there are. The issue of the so-called super-spreading incidence is enigmatic still. Healthcare worker transmission, I don't think we really understand that. Antigenic variation, how important that is. Pathogenesis, and finally, the animal reservoir. Just to point out, first of all, the laboratories in the WHO network. Initially, 11 laboratories that were involved, which subsequently grew to 14 or thereabouts, I think now. And finally, just to acknowledge my own colleagues in our group at the Department of Microbiology and Faculty of Science and Pathology, who were involved in the etiological studies, Dr. Lim of the Department of Health, with whom we worked very closely, and finally, not finally, but before finally, to really acknowledge the frontline healthcare workers in Hong Kong. I think it's really amazing that it is basically fighting a war, knowing that your life is on the line, and really nobody has run away. And I feel really proud to work there. And finally, I think our research program at Hong Kong University has been supported by NIH for our influenza program, and it is that infrastructure that allowed us to do whatever we have done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paris. Now for our final speaker for this morning session, it gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Alison McGeer, who's Professor of Laboratory Medicine and Parasitology and Public Health Sciences at the University of Toronto. She's done an impressive amount of work in the study of streptococcal pneumoniae, but has been a leader most recently in understanding and controlling the Toronto SARS outbreak. Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here this morning, and a particular pleasure to be what might be called at work without a mask on. Doesn't happen very often in Toronto anymore. I'd like, first of all, to take the opportunity to thank many members of the audience. There are, from our perspective in Toronto, almost no good things to be said about SARS. But the one good thing to be said about it is the phenomenal degree of collaboration and willingness to help of clinicians, epidemiologists, and researchers around the world. And I'd like to pass on a message from Toronto about how grateful we are for all of the assistance we've had from everyone in dealing with this outbreak. What I'm going to do over the next 15 or 20 minutes is give you a quick ground overview of the initial phase of the outbreak in Toronto, trying to highlight for you some of the challenges and questions that have arisen from it, and then spend a few moments talking about the clinical presentation and course of disease. The introduction to Toronto, as I'm sure all of you know, was associated with a woman who had traveled to Hong Kong and stayed in the Hotel Metropole. She died without medical attention, and her son, who was her primary caregiver, presented to hospital about 5 days after her death and was admitted to one of our community hospitals in Toronto. 2 days after his death, on the day of his death, we picked up the World Health Organization alert, and we also recognized illness on that day in 4 of the family members, 3 of them household contacts, and 1 family member who was not a household contact. Subsequent to the press conference the next day, the family physician of a number of members of this family who had at that time been ill for 7 days presented to medical attention, and her boyfriend, who is also a physician, was in fact on day 2 of illness on that day. Unbeknownst to us at the time, we had also been looking at transmission in patients in the hospital. This is a schematic of the observation unit in the emergency department at Scarborough Grace Hospital, the initial community hospital, on the night of March 7th, the night the second case was admitted. In the bed next to him in the observation room is Mr. P, and behind a wall and across the room, but sharing a primary care nurse, is Mr. D. Interestingly, that evening in the emergency department, we had no transmission to healthcare workers at all. But by the following week, both Mr. D and Mr. P were ill and had, in fact, both been discharged from the hospital and were readmitted with SARS. And on the day that Mr. P was admitted, which was day 5 of his illness, his wife was having her first day of fever. Give you a quick run of what happened from Mr. P and Mr. P's wife. There are 33 downstream cases from Mr. D, who spent 3 days in Scarborough Grace, 21 people. He was then transferred to a second hospital because of a need for renal dialysis, and his wife was subsequently admitted because in the early stages of SARS she fell and fractured her ribs, was admitted to an orthopedic ward, and there are 15 cases downstream from that. Mr. R is one of our unexplained cases. He had an outpatient appointment in what we thought was a zero-risk area of the hospital, but nonetheless, on admission on day 5, transmitted to a visitor, another patient, and 2 healthcare workers in the 24 hours he was in the first hospital, and was subsequently transferred to the Mount Sinai Hospital because he needed critical care. And in the 31 hours he was in our intensive care unit, transmitted to 7 healthcare workers. If you look at where our transmission sites have been, very clearly hospitals are the epicenter of this outbreak, and one of the important things to emphasize is that although the majority of infections have occurred in healthcare workers, we have also transmitted disease to a substantial number of patients and visitors to the hospital. This is not only transmission from patients to healthcare workers, but also transmission from healthcare workers to patients, and from patients and healthcare workers to visitors. We have seen transmission in physician offices, not nearly as commonly, but it clearly occurs. A large bulk of transmission in households, and a fair amount of transmission to family members who are not direct household contacts, but people who spend time caring for or being with ill patients in the home. It remains distinctly uncommon in what we would think of as true community settings. In the first phase of the outbreak in Toronto, we had transfer in the workplace in only one circumstance. People who spent a prolonged amount of time in a small room over one shift of work. And we have a couple of circumstances, we believe, in the current second wave of the outbreak in which people may have transmitted in the workplace, but it's clearly much less common. You do, however, occasionally hit circumstances where there is the opportunity for more transmission. The most obvious of these in Toronto is within the BLD Covenant community. This is a Catholic charismatic group that has members around the world and a fairly large membership in Toronto. These are people who have an extensive social network and a large number of activities through the church. I'm going to show you the origin of the initial case early in March, and you can then see that there was transmission to other family members and then to members of the extended family, physicians and physician offices, as well as a number of other members of the group before isolation and quarantine of members of that group stopped transmission within that group. Here's the picture of the first phase of the outbreak, and you'll see that it looks, in fact, a little different from Hong Kong. In the initial phase of the outbreak, here is the cluster of disease that represents transmission from the original patients, and then you then see downstream from that the transmission to household contacts and other community members, and it stopped over the Easter weekend in Toronto. I don't have a slide. What we've seen more recently, it's clear that although transmission in the community was stopped here in one of our community hospitals, and we believe it's only one, we had slow propagation from patient to patient on what we believe to be a single ward. On the release of precautions in hospital. Remember, during all of this time, in every hospital in Toronto, we are gowning, gloving, and masking for patient care at all times. The patients and visitors are unmasked. We have undetected transmission in patients and some visitors for a period of about a month. And when we stepped down our precautions on that ward, we had an implosion of transmission to visitors, patients, and healthcare workers on that ward. We still don't have one of our problems at the moment is understanding how it got onto that ward in the first place. It was not supposed to be there, and we missed it because we missed the epilink. We also don't understand how our implementation of precautions resulted in patient-to-patient transmission and transmission to visitors while protecting healthcare workers. I want to show you the range of transmission. One of the critical issues in terms of control in hospitals will be understanding that range of transmission. And I'm going to show you two patients to give you an idea of the differences. This is a schematic of the emergency room at Scarborough General Hospital, and the period of time we're talking about is the 16th of March from 10:45 to 11:30. Here's the walk-in entrance door and the patient waiting areas. It actually extends up here. As you come in through the door, there's a security office on your left, followed by two desks with the emergency registration clerks and a room behind them where a bed allocation clerk sits on the evening shift. The triage nurse's desk is here, and there is then a door which remains closed into the emergency department proper. The ambulance entrance is here and is separated by a wall and a door which is usually closed from the triage and waiting area, and also from the main area. This is glassed in here, and the ambulances come in here and wait for a moment. On the evening of the 16th, Mr. P arrived by ambulance. He came through the ambulance entrance with his wife. He spent about 3 minutes. People knew that he had been identified as potentially infectious, been called by the public health and follow-up, identified as ill, and referred to the hospital. He came through in precautions, waited for about 3 minutes here, and was taken directly to an airborne isolation room. His wife traveled with him. She's on day 1 of illness. When she comes into the emergency department, she is redirected into the triage area. Nobody, of course, recognizes that she is ill, and she spends about 45 minutes in the triage area registering him and then waiting until he's set up and organized, and then she returns to his room and spends, as far as we can tell, the rest of the night in his room she was not back in this waiting area. During that time, 5 visitors to patients developed illness. A security guard became ill. 3 ward clerks, the 3 clerks, the 2 in registration, the bed allocation, and the triage nurse. And in the rest of the department, we have infection in a housekeeper and a nurse, as well as the primary care nurse of Mr. P overnight. Strikingly, you see these little stars here? These are people who were out of the department by 11 o'clock or whose shift ended at 11 o'clock. Okay? So this is transmission, I think, similar to what we've been talking about might have been talking about in the elevator lobby of the Metropole. All of these people may have been close enough, although they can't recall it, they may have been close enough to be within droplet range of this lady. But they cannot have been in droplet range for more than a minute or two during this time period. No visitors who entered the emergency department after midnight that night became ill. Once this patient and his wife went up to the intensive care unit and were maintained in precautions, the only subsequent transmission that we've been able to identify was during his intubation procedure about 2 days later. His wife was subsequently admitted to our hospital, was in our hospital for about 5 weeks before she died. There was no transmission to people caring for her during that time, with the exception that we believe that the one healthcare worker who became ill is one of the 16 workers in Toronto who was infected despite the use of infection control precautions, and we think that this lady is the index case. In contrast, here's a gentleman who's part of a second wave of the outbreak. He came to an emergency department in another hospital on May the 12th and spent 14 hours in the emergency department. There were still some precautions being used in the emergency department at that time, and during the 14 hours he spent there, there was no transmission. He then spent 30 hours on one ward in the hospital, and during that time he transmitted the infection to 2 nurses and 2 of his roommates. Not entirely clear whether it was one roommate and then transmission from a roommate to another or directly to both roommates. About 30 hours later, he is transferred up to a second unit where he remains for a week, and you'll recognize that we're not through the 10-day incubation period yet, but we have so far identified no transmission from that gentleman. So these are 2 people of roughly the same age, both with no significant underlying illness, with very dramatically different degrees of transmission, and that's one of the critical things that we need to understand if we expect to be able to control this. Let me switch and talk for a few minutes about clinical disease and presentation, because one of the challenges, obviously, of dealing with this disease is being able to distinguish it both early on and in older, chronically ill people from other diseases. And what I'm going to give you is a summary of several different case series that have currently been published. A range of different sizes. I think one of the things that's important to recognize when you talk about clinical disease and SARS is that both the demographics and the degree of underlying illness and the case fatality rate are very substantially driven by who you're exposing. So it's not a disease where people are, when we talk about group A streptococcal disease or pneumococcal disease, there's a general exposure in the population, and you can expect those variables to be relatively stable. When you're talking about SARS, the issue is who you're exposing. The fact that these are all similar tells you that currently the epidemiology of who gets exposed in Hong Kong and in Toronto is similar, but that's not necessarily going to be true in all circumstances and forever. And as is, these are Toronto data, a few travel-related cases, a number of household contact-related cases, but again, the emphasis on, you notice that in our outbreak, about 50% of cases are in healthcare workers. There's another 27% that are in visitors and patients to the hospital. One of the things to worry about with this disease is that if you do not suspect it, a substantial fraction of patients will be seen prior to admission. Again, this is Toronto data, and you need to recognize that there's a very important differential when you're looking at presentation of illness, which is that if you're not expecting this disease, people present to their physician's offices on day 4 to 7 of illness, and to emergency departments generally on day 5 to 10. It takes a substantial amount of this time with illness to get really sick. What happens when you start to control the illness is you do active surveillance, you're looking for people, and you start to detect and identify people on day 1 or 2, and then the presentation of illness looks very, very different. And when you're talking about presentation of illness, you need to understand what kind of settings you're looking at. Nonetheless, we, in both the first and second phase of the outbreak, we have a very substantial number of people who present to physician offices and emergency departments before they're recognized as illness, and almost invariably they get sent home with a diagnosis of viral illness, and in our setting about half of them get sent home on antibiotics from that first visit. The median time from first visit to admission here is entirely a reflection of the fact that we made a conscious decision in Toronto fairly early in the outbreak that we knew we had seen a lot of household transmission. We were not confident in our ability to isolate people at home and protect their household contacts, and consequently we attempted where we could to admit everybody that we thought had SARS to the hospital to get them into isolation and to prevent household contact transmission. Appears to be effective, but it's of course an enormous load on the healthcare system to attempt to do that. And one of the second things we urgently need to understand is these people, most people in the first week of their illness are not sufficiently ill to need to be in the hospital. But until we understand whether we can protect their household contacts with interventions at home, we're all going to be worried about how safely we can leave them at home. Here are the list of symptoms at presentation. I think there are, from a couple of different studies, again, fairly strikingly similar until you get down to those symptoms that you hope will distinguish SARS from other illnesses. And at that level, there are some striking differences. For instance, in the 3% is from the Toronto outbreak. For us in Toronto, it appears to have been very effective that if you get an upper respiratory illness with prominent coryzal and sinus symptoms, you can say that people don't have SARS. This is not nearly so true in the Hong Kong data. And this really just emphasizes that we don't have good clinical distinguishing features that allow you. We're really heavily dependent on the epidemiologic data to distinguish SARS from non-SARS in the early stages of illness. Again, at presentation, the percentage of normal chest x-rays varies with how early you detect illness. It often takes until day 7 of illness for an abnormal chest x-ray to appear, and almost every pattern of lung involvement has been described, so that it is not safe to make assumptions about what the disease is from the appearance of the chest x-ray. Is a relatively consistent but unfortunately pattern that is unfortunately not good enough to really distinguish it. About a third of people have low white counts, nearly 3/4 are lymphopenic, 45% are thrombocytopenic, and a majority have elevated LDHs with some elevations in creatine kinase and liver function tests. Again, if you are looking for disease and seeing people early in illness, these lab tests are not nearly so helpful. It takes time for them to develop. And a group in Canada are now looking at comparing Tom Mary's large series of community-acquired pneumonias to the presentation of SARS. And I have to tell you that so far it's relatively discouraging. About 20% of people presenting with community-acquired pneumonias of other etiologies are lymphopenic at presentation. And it's unlikely that these markers are actually going to be very helpful. Let me skip over the pathology and talk for a minute about outcomes. One of the problems in dealing with the media in particular about this disease is this is a slowly progressive disease. We are all accustomed when we look at community-acquired diseases to diseases in which the greatest mortality is within the 2 or 3 days of illness, and then there's a tail out to 7 days, and if you haven't died by 7 days, you probably didn't die from the illness. This is not true of SARS. SARS is a slowly progressive disease. In general, its severity, if you're going to get better, its severity peaks somewhere between day 13 and 16 of illness, and then you start to get better. People who are not going to survive continue to get progressively worse, but it takes 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks for those people to die. And so when you look at the case fatality rate, even a month into the outbreak, it doesn't look so bad, and then it starts to get progressively worse. Here is where I think we are with treatment options. Interestingly, independently, clinician groups around the world faced with an unknown illness with an obvious high case fatality rate chose to try ribavirin in the absence of any other data. Well, somehow these have become switched here. This is good. Sort of the way we feel in Toronto these days. It's okay. Ribavirin has no in vitro activity, and we have discontinued its use in Toronto. It's associated with a significant number of short-term side effects. We will, therefore, now that we have a resurgence in the outbreak, we will have a group of patients treated with ribavirin, a group treated with ribavirin steroids, and a group treated with steroids alone, and that may be of some utility in trying to distinguish between them. Interferon obviously has activity in vitro and will be important to look at. All of us clinicians are a little nervous about the side effects of interferon in people who are not that severely ill, and I think it's not clear to us at what level we should be using interferon. And there are a number of studies that are starting using immune globulin, and I think we all have hopes that that may be effective. Thank you.
I'd like to invite the presenters to come up to the stage, and we could proceed with the discussion portion of the program. Molly? I'd like to invite anyone who has any questions or comments. See Marty?
I'd just like to ask Dr. McGeer, you mentioned immune globulin. What kind of immune globulin are you talking about that would have appropriate amount of antibodies to utilize?
Allison, press the button. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're talking about serum immune globulin from recovered patients, treated immune globulin. And I understand that trials have started in Hong Kong. Maybe Dr. Pierce can address that.
A question for Dr. Pierce. Could you tell us a little bit more about these possible animal reservoirs, the civet cats and the raccoon dog? I mean, how common are they? What kind of contact happens between them and humans? Are they a source of food eaten or anything like that?
Actually, we can't say a lot. The finding from the study answer one question, namely that there is apparently the presence of the SARS coronavirus outside the human body. But that's the only question which is being answered. There are many more questions which this study cannot answer. We don't know how widespread this virus is in southern China. In which other animal species would it exist? For how long is the virus excreted, if at all, by these and other animal species? Why is it only in civets? Well, it's in one animal family and in another, raccoon dogs, and not in other carnivores. We have relatively little information also on the interaction between these animals. What we know is, for instance, that the civet cats were sampled on different sides of the market, so they were not really in contact with each other. So we know much less after this study than we have actually found out with the study. But what is certainly clear is that if we want to control the disease, we have to take into consideration that there is a possible reservoir outside the human body, and we have to get ready to deal with this reservoir if we are getting closer to the control of the disease in humans.
I think my colleague talked about if I can just summarize the broad conclusions that I think one can draw from it. It does seem to be an animal virus that has been isolated, not a human virus that has gone back to animals, although that possibility can't be completely excluded. The second thing that one can probably say is that these live game markets are probably a source of risk, of public health risk. Now, whether these particular animals are the real reservoirs or whether they are just picking up virus and amplifying them within the market setting, I think is an open question. And one really needs to go trapping wild animals and demonstrating the presence of the virus before one can be sure exactly what the reservoir is.
Zimin Zheng from NCI. I have a question for Dr. Paris and Dr. Klaus Stoll regarding the etiology issues. Since the SARS outbreak, I constantly contacted with the people in China in the front against the SARS and the virus and other agents. I would appreciate both of you could clarify the information to the role of final identify the coronavirus agent, and especially some, the information I learned from Chinese people about the chlamydia infections in the patients. And what is your comments on that, the chlamydia identified in the patient biopsy samples by EM and by assassination? And you exclude the influenza at the beginning and other the animal viruses as agent for the SARS infections. But you haven't excluded the chlamydia issues, which I learned from many Chinese investigators, especially like Hong Tao in Institute of Virology and the other institute in Beijing.
Okay, I think with SARS is a clinical case definition. And clearly that's going to pull in a diverse range of things depending on the setting that you apply that case definition. If you have a high prevalence situation, a lot of your cases that fit the case definition are going to be SARS. If it is a low prevalence situation, you're going to have a lot of background noise. Equally, it is true that there are many patients that are going to have pneumonia with many different agents. I mean, influenza, chlamydia, and so many things. But I think even the group from Beijing, when they have looked at the postmortem tissues that they think they find chlamydia, they can, as I understand, also see coronavirus particles there. So co-infection does seem to be another issue that we really have not addressed in great detail. But I think if you look at the totality of the information, I think it is true to say that the coronavirus is probably the one that opens the door. It may be sufficient by itself, and I think in many cases it is, but it may be opening the door to co-infections, and that is quite possible as well.
I wear two hats. One is a clinician and hospital epidemiologist at a Minneapolis hospital. Has Zygris or activated human protein C been used in certain of these patients in, for instance, Canada or Hong Kong?
They have been used in small numbers of patients, but the numbers are too small. They clearly haven't been miraculous. I think they clearly haven't been miraculous, is I think all we can say about them. The numbers are really too small to know whether they have any effect.
This will be quick. The epidemiologist hat is we have 65,000 visits to our emergency room, and we're a hub in Minneapolis for Northwest Orient. What would you do as hospital epidemiologists for our emergency room? And I don't want an answer. I just am trying to stimulate here. I've had a lot of trouble with just the CDC recommendations and gone quite a bit further, but please comment. I don't know how we're so lucky here in the United States.
First, I'd like to thank the speakers for wonderful talks. And I have a question about the pathophysiology of the ARDS picture. And my question is there any evidence of a correlation between the rise in the antibody titer in patients and the onset of ARDS and the relationship between the antibody levels, the white count, and death?
Yes, I mean, we studied a cohort of 75 patients that has been reported already. And of course, it is generally speaking true that the ARDS, the pulmonary complications and ARDS starts at the beginning of the second week and through the second week. and the seroconversion occurs around that time as well. But whether the two are connected or not is quite difficult to say. In that particular paper, actually, if you look at the IgG seroconversion pattern, it seems to have a bimodal distribution. About 60% of patients seroconverted within 18 days or so, and the remainder took much longer. We actually look at those two groups to see if there was a correlation between that delayed seroconversion and severity of disease, and there was not. So I don't know whether one can say much more than that.
Thank you.
This question is addressed to Dr. McGeer and Dr. Paris. Have you seen any evidence of central nervous system involvement in any of these patients? Dr. McGeer mentioned headache. Have you looked post-mortem for evidence of viral RNA or virus in the brains?
We have been doing limited autopsies and have not looked at brain tissue. We have not seen CNS involvement clinically in any of the patients.
You're aware that the human common cold viruses, OC43 and 2290, have both been reported in the CNS?
Certainly from the Hong Kong experience, again, unfortunately, the early postmortems did not look into the brain for two reasons. It was thought to be rather hazardous to open up the brain, and I guess people did not really think, it's a big problem to look at. But now, I mean, clinically, we are finding some of the late complications of patients who have recovered. They do have a neurological problem, both in terms of memory and more subtle psychological problems. Now, whether that is due to the steroid use is, of course, quite possible, but whether it is due to the virus getting to the CNS is also a possibility. And at this point in time, we do not have the answer.
Annie DeGroot, Brown University and Epivax. I just have a question to any of the panelists, whether there might be any clues as yet to the role of cell-mediated immunity in this disease. Are there, for example, more cases among individuals who have compromised cellular immunity, people with immunodeficiency, or who might be on drugs, who might be on chemotherapy?
Well, we had one patient who was immunocompromised from hemic malignancy who got infected. And that patient presented very atypically. He just had fever for quite a long time, very little chest problems or X-ray changes until very late. And even then, it was very atypical. So that is just one patient. So it might suggest that if you do have compromisation of your cell-mediated immune response, maybe your disease spectrum is going to be different.
We've seen 2 transplant patients on immunosuppression as our only overtly immunosuppressed patients, and 1 patient in chronic renal failure. They've all done badly and died, but so have most other, over 60-year-old people with less severe illness. So I don't know that we can say specifically about degree of immunocompromise.
How about HIV-infected patients? Any one of you have any experience with HIV-infected individuals?
No, we don't.
There is data now from China. I think our Chinese colleagues are looking into AIDS patients and HIV-infected patients. There is a small study ongoing. Data are not available yet. There is an anecdotal information from Guangdong where on one of the floors in the hospitals, AIDS patients were served or were kept, and on the other side of the floor, the SARS patients were confined. And there has been no transmission from SARS patients to AIDS patients. There has been no disease reported, even though there was poor hospital infection control practices. But again, that's anecdotal information.
Could I just ask a question of the panel? I was so struck. We said there were a lot of unanswered questions, but since part of the discussion this morning was on epidemiology, Allison, in your presentation, we were all very struck by the case presentation of the person who came in through the ambulance entrance, and then you essentially had 7 or so cases just in that small room. We know the Amoy Gardens is somewhat of an outlier, still not totally explained. But if you look at what happened in your emergency admitting room, it is astounding that we don't have 80,000 cases instead of 8,000 cases. And I'm wondering if you or any of the panelists would comment on that, because what happened in your room certainly has happened in many other places where people who are sick and don't happen to go to a hospital, but go into a party or a wedding or a bar mitzvah or something like that. Why don't we have 80,000 or 800,000 cases now?
I mean, I think the logical answer, if there's such thing as a logical answer in this setting, is that we're back to these super shedders. There are some people who, for reasons we don't understand, are very highly infectious, and until we saw the data from this lady and teased it out, that was in general associated with people who were later on in their illness and who were older and had compromised status, and we explained it by saying, your viral load increases and you become more infectious, and that does in general seem to be the pattern. But there is very obviously, and I think quite distinct from other infectious diseases, a very high degree of difference in infectivity between patients, and presumably the reason we don't see it is because very few patients carry that degree of infectivity for any period of time. But I think remain completely baffled, and I haven't heard any logical explanations of why that should be so.
Right.
Yeah, the whole story actually does not fit together with this disease. We have a very slow progression of the disease. We have, during the first period of time, in most patients, a relatively small amount of virus excreted in comparison to what's been happening in the second week. Very few, during that very first phase of the disease, infect very many other people in a relatively short period of time, very often by casual contact. We have most of the transmission, as far as frequency is concerned, during the second stage of the disease, during the second week, which is actually not characterized, as far as we know, by virus replication. It's more an overexuberant immune reaction, which leads perhaps to these damages in the lung. It's not the virus, this is not the period of time when most of the virus is actually being excreted. So all these data do not actually fit together, and there's a lot of, certainly, room for research.
Mark Miller, Fogarty, NIH. I find it remarkable that early on in this epidemic there was a very incipient spread, that we were very much able to follow the chains early on in transmission. And I think the combination of severe disease and greater infectivity later on in the course of infection rather than early prevented a very rapid dissemination. And it also speaks against asymptomatic carriers. Given that much of viral illness is frequently spread through children, one can understand in the hospital setting, if there's not a heterogeneous mixing, as you have in the community, that you would expect mostly adults to be infected. But once it's spread throughout the community, one should expect at least infections in children. And so my questions are, what is the percentage that you found of unlinked chains of transmission, in other words, speaking of asymptomatic carriers, and do you have any results of serosurveys of exposed children?
Tough question. There is data, not from all sites, and I can start with the one I know, and perhaps Malik, you can add. There is at the tail end of the disease, in Hong Kong, as well as there was also in Vietnam, but just the sample size did not suffice. But also during one stage in Taiwan, it was clear that the persons who were considered to be SARS suspect and probable cases increased, which were PCR virus isolation negative and did not seroconvert. So you had a larger number of false positive SARS probable and suspect cases. And that also, in one way, was the case for children. As far as we know, there has been no transmission to children, between children, and there has been no deaths in children. Now, you said that the absence of indication of transmission from asymptomatic carriers would be an indication of the importance of of asymptomatic care. I do believe that there are asymptomatic, certainly people are excreting who are asymptomatic, but which role they play in the epidemic of the disease remains to be seen. So perhaps that's part of the answer, I hope.
Can I just add to that? I mean, clearly there are children who are infected. I mean, in Hong Kong we have about 110 children with SARS. At least half of them, which we ourselves have looked at serologically, and almost all of them do seroconvert. So, but this is a tight group with very clear contact histories. They are much milder, certainly the younger children, leaving aside the adolescents who have more adult-like disease. The younger children have a very mild disease. Some of the unknown questions is the viral load similar in children and adults? What about children who are outside this contact group? So those are things that we're looking at the moment, but we don't have the answers.
I'm afraid we have time only for 2 more quick questions, so we'll take one here and one there, because otherwise we'll be dreadfully behind time.
Hi, I'm Gwen Zahner. I'm an epidemiologist and visiting professor at the Beijing Genomics Institute, Chinese Academy of Sciences, and I flew here from Beijing. And my question is for Drs. Storr and Fauci, and it refers to, pertains to how you're...
Can you speak up, please?
It pertains to how you are establishing your SARS International Research Network, particularly with regard to research sites from the affected areas in mainland China. And I've read many of the publications and listened to the presentations this morning, and I'm concerned that there's an intensive amount of research currently going on in the mainland from very good centers that are not being represented in this conference and in an upcoming WHO conference. So my question is, how do you establish your network, and how will you engage the different groups in mainland China, which is clearly critical to containing this disorder?
I'll try to answer the second question. It's very difficult at this current stage to involve our colleagues in China for various reasons. One is the Ministry of Science and Technology in China is giving funds for SARS research projects, both at central level, at provincial level, and at district level. There are very many people applying for funds. There are very many different groups who are involved in endorsing various funding activities, and there appears also to be no, as far as we know, a centralized strategy to focus on aspects. There's also, I mean, as far as we know, there has been no similar meeting like this or others during which the roadmap would be laid out. We know that there is a central committee which is established between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Science and Technology. But coordinating these activities in the huge country like this is a task on its own, let alone to bring this into an international concerted action. It's very difficult. We are trying very hard, but still, I must admit that we still don't have the full agenda the Chinese colleagues have. We know that they are focusing currently on six major areas. And one is origin of SARS, distribution in animals, serological studies in humans in Guangdong and Beijing, molecular biology, stability in the environment, excretion of the virus, and seroconversion of close contacts. But the detailed projects are internationally not known, and I'm sure that if we want to get answers to many of the questions which we all have here, we have to go to China and help our colleagues over there.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to switch and have one more question, but it'll be right here if you don't mind, sir, because because one of the answers to your question, we do have our colleagues from mainland China here standing right behind you, as a matter of fact, Dr. Yiming Xiao.
Well, I've also brought a lot of data from mainland China, from our institute.
Oh, okay. Yiming, you want to make a comment, please?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment. And I think there are, as the WHO official mentioned, there are quite a lot of research going on in China. And they were also trying to send people to this meeting. But because they are extremely busy, overloaded, they just, since I'm here, he just asked me to bring some message. I think there's a lot of research going on, and also mentioned the Hong Kong researcher at the early stage have collaborated closely with Canton, the province next to Hong Kong. And also There have already been two international events. A big Chinese delegation went to the ASEAN meeting about 2 weeks ago, and our Prime Minister is there. And also in the WHO General Assembly, there's a large Chinese delegation there. And next Tuesday, there will be a ASEAN +3 and plus many, about 20 countries join a SARS meeting in Beijing, starting from next Tuesday. So NIH is sending a large delegation. There's a lot of research will be supported, and actually the CIPRA program for AIDS, the P3 laboratory built for the CIPRA and for the monkey facility have all been taken by the government research group for SARS. So we are, being the direct PI of the CIPRA, we agree to provide the NIH resources for the country's CIPRA SARS research.
Thank you very much, Yiming. So with that, we'll have to close this first session, take about a 25-minute break, and be back here at 10 after 11, and we'll come on with the next part of the morning session. Thank you.
We want to start this second session, and our first speaker of this second session on coronaviruses is no stranger to the field. It's Dr. Catherine Holmes, who used to be here in Washington but has been at the University of Colorado for a few years. And it is my pleasure to introduce Kay to talk to us about coronaviruses. Kay, you want to...
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about animal coronaviruses. And I really represent a very large group of people in the United States and Europe, Japan, and other countries who have been involved in studying coronavirus diseases of animals and humans for many years. So what I'll try to do today is put the information you've heard about SARS into perspective with the other coronaviruses. This is an indication of what the SARS coronavirus might look like. And we will talk briefly about coronavirus biology and pathogenesis. And the topics that I will address today are coronaviruses, how they're classified, what their structural proteins are, briefly how they replicate, and that will be covered in considerably more detail by Mark Denison. Some idea about what possible drug targets might be, and then I'll talk about coronavirus diseases of man and animals as they relate to SARS. Coronaviruses were first organized as a group back in the late 1960s, and it was done by electron microscopy. These beautiful spikes that surround the virus particles are really the delivery system for the virus, and they have also been used for the identification of coronaviruses as different from other respiratory viruses. And this is important because most coronaviruses, or many coronaviruses, at least the other human ones that are known, do not isolate readily from human samples as the SARS virus has so kindly done. And so it was necessary to actually see them in electron microscopy of patient specimens. This is a more generic picture of a coronavirus, and this is actually a group 2 coronavirus, and it has several important components. Inside the virus is this 30,000 base genome. It's an RNA genome, the largest of all the viral RNA genomes. And it is a positive strand RNA, and if it's delivered into any cell, it can infect it. That would be transfection. The way the virus delivers it is actually by means of the spike protein, which is a type 1 viral fusion protein, and that is very, very species-specific and tissue-specific, as I'll show you. There's also a hemagglutinin esterase protein on some coronaviruses, particularly the bovine and the murine ones, which plays a role in binding the virus to sugars on the cell surface. There's an M protein, which is a unique M protein in that it's a transmembrane glycoprotein that forms this unique viral envelope, which the virus buds in the Golgi apparatus, and that gives unique lipids to the virus, and this gives a unique structure and stability compared with many other envelope viruses you may be familiar with. The E viral glycoprotein is important as a scaffolding protein, and the nucleocapsid protein is forming this helical nucleocapsid. The SARS would look like this, except it lacks the HE glycoprotein. Very briefly, coronavirus replication begins when the virus interacts with a specific receptor on host cells and delivers the plus strand RNA into the cell. Then it makes minus strand templates, full length for the genome, and then subgenomic minus strands not shown here for each of these subgenomic messenger RNAs. And Mark will talk about that in considerable detail. Suffice it to say that the overlapping common messenger RNAs with common 3' ends are the hallmark of all coronaviruses. And they all share this complex replication strategy. And for the structural proteins at the 3' end of the genome, there is a single protein made from each of these messages, even though they have the same 3' end. The virus particles assemble by budding into a pre-Golgi compartment, and then they move into smooth-walled vesicles and are released from the cells by exocytosis. I've been interested for a long time in how the coronaviruses adapt themselves to one host species. The 2 human coronaviruses that cause from 15 to 30% of colds in people can only be grown in human cells, and they had to be isolated in human fetal tracheal organ cultures because they're so cell-specific and tissue-specific. And I will point out that SARS virus has not yet been grown, to my knowledge, in a human cell. It's only this very fortunate discovery of the vero cells and the fetal kidney rhesus cells. And so in the group 1 genetic groups of coronaviruses, the pig has several viruses, an enteric one, a respiratory one, another enteric one, and there are several other coronaviruses. And you can see a theme here in that many of these are enteric viruses that cause diarrhea, particularly in young animals, and many of them are respiratory. And they're usually, and this is a very important point, only infecting the cells of the respiratory or enteric epithelium. That's it. They're not usually systemic. Only a few of these viruses, like mouse hepatitis virus and PEDV and, can't find it right now, sometimes IBV can go to the kidney, and the cat virus can do this. And so this presents special problems for vaccine production when most of the viruses infect these epithelial tissues. We know that SARS, which has been suggested because of its genetic distance from these 3 known coronavirus groups, some people have suggested that it should be in a coronavirus group 4, and this also infects respiratory tissues, but the virus has not actually, the antigens have not actually been seen in autopsy specimens yet. We believe it can be enteric, and some has been isolated from kidney occasionally. Well, just to put these all in context, this is the new taxonomy for coronaviruses, and they are in the nidovirales. Here, the coronaviridae, and the 4, 3, and maybe 4th group of coronaviruses. Toroviruses are similar, and arteriviruses, lactic dehydrogenase, simian hemorrhagic fever, and even here, the new ronivirus group of ocaviruses, which infect shrimp and cause yellowhead virus disease, an economically important disease of farmed shrimp in Asia. Okay? So these viruses all have that same common replication strategy of the nested, that's what nido means, 3' messenger RNAs. But interestingly enough, they have quite different viral structures. So we've seen the helical nucleocapsid of coronaviruses. There's a torus-shaped nucleocapsid for the toroviruses. Arteriviruses have an icosahedral nucleocapsid, and ocaviruses are rod-shaped, the common feature being their replication strategies. The delivery system that I mentioned is the spike glycoprotein, And this is very important for determining the host range and the tissue specificity. The spike binds by means of the tip of the spikes to receptors, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and that's a species-specific binding in many cases. And the fusion of the viral envelope with the host cell membrane is directed by this S2 part of the viral glycoprotein. For the group 2 coronaviruses, there is a protease activation, a cleavage between S1 and S2 that activates fusion and infectivity, but that's not true for several of the other coronaviruses, and I don't know yet if it's true for SARS. Importantly, as I'll show you, big deletions in the S1 region can alter the tissue tropism of some of the coronaviruses, and we know that pH-dependent conformational changes in spike actually are different from the other group 1 coronaviruses, or group 1 fusion proteins that you know, because this can be triggered to undergo a major conformational change either by soluble receptor or by pH 8. So it's alkaline triggered. And the virus is a target for neutralizing antibodies, and so this is the important part of the virus for developing vaccines. The entry of the virus nucleocapsid here from the virus into the host cell depends upon several steps. In some cases, the hemagglutinin esterase glycoprotein binds first to a sugar moiety on the cell surface, 9-O-acetyl neurominic acid, and then binds to the receptor. And this binding triggers conformational changes in the viral spike protein and possibly also in the receptor that may allow co-receptor binding. We're not sure about this yet, but definitely bring together the viral envelope and the host cell membrane to let that positive strand viral nucleic acid into the cell. Now, much has been made about fusion inhibitors that have already been discovered, and fusion inhibitors for HIV depend on this fusion domain, the GP41 of its class 1 viral fusion protein. And here is to scale the fusion domain of influenza hemagglutinin. This, on the other hand, is the fusion domain of mouse hepatitis virus, one of the class 2 coronaviruses. And what I would point out to you is that it's huge. Okay? There is also over here an equal-sized part, which is the receptor binding domain. So even though it is a class 1 viral fusion protein, there are many things to be discovered yet. For example, we don't know where the fusion peptide lies, and we have no idea what this large region is doing functionally with this virus spike. Fortunately, there's been a great deal of work on the spike proteins of coronaviruses in many labs, and I hope that we'll be able to build upon that in studying SARS. I mentioned that the spike determines the host range, and I show you here what the receptors are that the virus sees. Interestingly, all the group 1 coronaviruses, including 229E, the respiratory coronavirus, use aminopeptidase N as their receptors. But interestingly, they use them in a species-specific manner. So human aminopeptidase N is a good receptor for human virus, but not at all a receptor for the pig virus, and vice versa. Pig aminopeptidase N cannot be used by human by human coronavirus. And we have shown that this is due to a single N-linked glycan, which is sticking out in a critical place in this pig aminopeptidase N. So as the viruses and their hosts evolve together, the spike protein adapts to changes such as addition of a glycoprotein or something, or glycan on the receptor. And we have also identified a receptor for mouse hepatitis virus, which is called now murine CCAM1, and it's a member of the immunoglobulin superfamily that I'll show you in a moment. All the places where there are no receptors listed, there are no receptors yet known. And the co-receptor for this 9-O-acetylated neurominic acid is a factor in infection with some of these group 2 coronaviruses, but is not important for SARS coronavirus because it lacks the hemagglutinin esterase glycoprotein. So here is a model of what aminopeptidase N looks like. It's a class 2 glycoprotein, and the virus binds to the amino terminal part of this molecule. And it has, as all virus receptors do, functions of its own for the cell. The enzymatic activity of this protein are not needed for virus infection. It's just been a fortuitous thing that these viruses have all decided, the group 1 viruses have all decided to use it for receptor. And this is the crystal structure of murine CCAM1A, which is the receptor for all of the murine coronaviruses, mouse hepatitis virus. And the virus actually binds to the immunoglobulin domain here on the surface here in the CC prime loop, and projecting from this is an exposed isoleucine 41, which we have postulated is an important determinant for binding of the virus. Surrounding that are several charged residues, and what we are doing is looking down from the top of this molecule as if the virus spike were trying to recognize it. And so we have looked at the species specificity by mutating isoleucine 41. And I show you here the CCAM molecules of the susceptible mouse, of humans, and rats. These viruses, the mouse hepatitis viruses, cannot bind to human or rat cells. And there's even a resistant mouse which has a mutant here that makes it resistant to the virus. And what I'm going to show you is a mutation here that makes this receptor like rat CCAM1. And this is just a plaque assay using, doesn't show up too well here, isoleucine 41 changed to proline. And this is a mouse cell that has the normal receptor on it. And infecting with wild-type virus, you can see that the plaques are totally different. The black here is cells expressing viral antigen, and the clear areas are where the virus has killed the cells. So in these, there's, in this mutated receptor, a single row of infected cells that just moves out, and it's quite a different thing from this. So a mutation that would affect species specificity in a receptor can inhibit virus spread. And that's just a point mutation, and there are many others. Now, it's possible, only recently, to introduce mutations into the genome of this large 30,000 base RNA. And there are two methods by which that has been done. One is reverse genetics using full-length infectious clones, and Mark Denison will speak about that in the next talk. And the other is targeted RNA recombination, pioneered by Paul Masters and Peter Rotier. And this is an example of how this is done. So Paul and Peter have engineered a mouse hepatitis virus that contains a chimeric feline spike, the exodomain being all from the feline and the transmembrane cytoplasmic domain from the mouse. And this virus can only infect cat cells. And it is used to infect cat cells that are then transfected with this long synthetic donor RNA that contains a mutation in a mouse coronavirus spike. Recombination occurs very frequently in these viruses. So Michael Lai's lab has shown that there's a very high frequency in infected cells between virus genomes, and Paul has made use of this to allow us to rescue viruses that have the isogenic background. The entire 30,000 bases are conserved with a single point mutation in the spike. And we have used this technique to isolate some viruses and ask about, in the receptor binding domain, the amino terminal 330 amino acids, which are the important residues for species specificity of mouse coronavirus binding. Taguchi had identified 3 regions that were conserved in all strains of mouse hepatitis virus in this critical receptor binding domain, and postulated that those would be important residues for binding to the receptor. But in fact, when we compared the mouse viruses, and here are several listed here, with the rat coronavirus, bovine coronavirus, and human coronavirus in group 2, we found that these same regions, 1, 2, and 3, are completely conserved in all of the group 2 viruses, so they're probably structural. Instead, we found scattered several residues that were different, that were conserved in all the mouse strains, but were different in the rat, bovine, and human strains. And so we have focused on these residues, and I'll just show you a little bit of Larissa Thackeray's data today, making point mutations in these. These are the viruses that we isolated by targeted RNA recombination. Many of them grow well. Here's the wild type. This one has extended fusion capacity. Many of them will infect a single cell and not spread beyond that. And some won't infect any cells at all. So these are indeed critical single residues in the spike that determine species specificity. And I think that's important as people are beginning to compare genomes of SARS and finding point mutations, to think that these point mutations, some of them may be important in changing receptor specificity. Let me talk now about coronavirus diseases of man, a little bit about their pathogenesis, immune responses, and epidemiology as a lead-in to vaccines. So bovine coronavirus is really a fine example of a pneumoenteric coronavirus. It's in group 2. And I should have said that SARS lies somewhere between group 2 and group 3 in many of its characteristics. And the main difference from group 2 is that it doesn't have the hemagglutinin protein that this bovine coronavirus has. Bovine coronavirus can cause 4 different diseases in cows. Calf diarrhea, called calf scours, has been known to be a problem for a long time. Winter dysentery was more recently discovered. It's a bloody diarrhea of adult cattle that occurs in the wintertime. And calves can also get a respiratory disease with this virus. And adult cattle can get shipping fever when herds are commingled, brought in from various places, such as a food market or feeding lot. And they share the virus, and then they're also under terrific stress, and they come down with what virologists have classically called shipping fever. It's also caused by other kinds of respiratory viruses, but Hans Storks has shown that a high percentage of these are in fact from the bovine coronavirus, which can infect both the respiratory and enteric tracts. There is only one serotype with 2 subtypes for all of these coronaviruses, and people are looking at the mutations that may be associated with different virulence and tissue tropism factors. Interestingly, viruses closely related, very closely related to bovine coronavirus, have been found by Linda Safe in white-tailed deer, waterbuck, and sambal deer in zoos, and also in turkeys. Jamie Breslin found a turkey coronavirus that's associated with infectious bronchitis virus in group 3, but Serge D found a transmissible turkey enteritis that is very much like bovine coronavirus, but causes a serial disease in turkey. So this is a major jump. And I'm sorry, these arrows have kind of migrated in the thing, but this is one case of human diarrhea in a child has also been traced to a bovine coronavirus. A different pattern of disease and infection is that caused by the feline coronaviruses. Feline enteric coronavirus infects kittens and is a very common virus. And it causes a little bit of diarrhea and then may cause persistent inapparent enteric infection for months. So if a cat is isolated, this may last shedding virus for 7 months. In that cat, there may be mutations to systemic infection, and these mutations can be in a non-structural protein and also in the spike protein, and they can lead to feline infectious peritonitis, which is a fatal disease that has either a wet or dry form depending upon the immune response, the cell-mediated immune response to the virus. And once this mutant virus has occurred, the cat will die. In addition, cats who have been infected as kittens with the enterotropic strain can be reinfected after their shedding with different strains of FIPV, or they can be vaccinated. Either of these two potentiates a much more severe disease when they meet the virus again. This is an antibody-dependent enhancement of disease, which is a cautionary tale for people trying to develop vaccines against coronaviruses. The pig coronaviruses give another example. This is transmissible gastroenteritis virus in piglets, which caused an enteric disease that spread from farm to farm and was a problem in Europe. Then deletions arose of about 225 amino acids in one particular part of the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, giving rise to porcine respiratory coronavirus, which caused a milder respiratory disease of pigs with some interstitial pneumonia. And that virus then spread through Europe and almost eliminated TGEV as an enteric disease. Okay? And it's a milder disease, and so even though people were developing vaccines against TGEV, they no longer need them because the disease has almost been spontaneously eliminated. In the humans, this is a case from Chilvers in 2001. There is no small animal model, and so human volunteers have been used, inoculated intranasally with human respiratory coronaviruses. And in general, because perhaps most of us have antibodies against both of the human respiratory coronaviruses, many people who are infected don't get symptoms, and a few do get a definite cold with headache, cough, and fever. But in all of these, there's disruption of the nasal epithelium. So with human respiratory coronaviruses, there are carriers which have inapparent infection and may shed virus. For this, there is no animal model or reservoir. The viruses are amazingly genetically stable. There's common inapparent infection, repeated reinfection, seasonal outbreaks of disease, and as yet no drugs or vaccines. Contrast that mild disease to, SARS, which is what you've just heard about before, very serious lower respiratory tract disease with hardly any upper respiratory tract symptoms. And you've heard about these things. What I wanted to point out to you is the importance of understanding how long and from where the virus is shed. The pathogenesis of SARS is not well understood, and I think many of the animal models will provide good instruction, particularly studies on the immune responses in mice and pigs and cows, will be very helpful in vaccine development. The question of persistent infection is important. Many of the coronaviruses infect persistently, even in animals who've been sick before and appear immunologically otherwise normal. They shed virus for long periods and are susceptible to reinfection. There are several targets for therapy against coronaviruses, and that would be vaccines that would induce neutralizing antibody, fusion inhibitors that would prevent the entry of the virus, receptor blockade. The synthesis of the viral polyprotein is dependent upon proteases to cleave the polyprotein into functional units, and there are protease inhibitors that can be used. The polyprotein assembles into a polymerase complex where transcription and replication occur. This is a unique structure for coronaviruses that might be an interesting drug target. Mark will talk more about the replication of the virus. And exocytosis, virus assembly, and budding can also be additional drug targets. And in the recent meeting that we were just at in Holland on the nidovirales, we were pleased to find that there are many places where progress has been made here. So receptor interactions, we've shown in the mouse system that antibody against the receptor blocks MHV interaction in vitro and also in vivo. SARS coronavirus can induce cell fusion, which is inhibited by heptad repeat peptides, as David Ho has recently shown. Hey, these are supposed to fly out. I apologize for that. The 3C-like protease has been modeled by Hilgenfeld and his colleagues, who have suggested an inhibitor recently. An inhibitor of the papain-like protease has also been tested. This is important for replication. Oligonucleotide inhibitors of replication are in test. For group 2 coronaviruses, acetylesterase inhibitors are also important. And finally, a word about vaccines. There are a number of vaccines for animal coronaviruses because they cause such economically important diseases that have been tried. One of the most successful is the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus vaccine. This is a virus like 229E in group 1, and it grows in vero cells. And this is a live attenuated virus developed by 90 times passing it in vero cells. The disease has gone away, so the need for the vaccine is less serious. What's happened is that all the pigs in Europe got infected with this virus, so the mother pigs have antibodies, and when the baby pigs become exposed to the virus, it's a much more mild disease than it was during its initial introduction in the 1980s in Europe. Infectious bronchitis virus in chickens is a serious problem, and the vaccine has problems because there are multiple serotypes, and recombination between the virus vaccine and the wild-type viruses that the flock may be exposed to have been detected. There are killed vaccines. They don't work very well. Vectored vaccines for TGEV partly protect, but you have this problem of mucosal immunity, where even if you can prevent serious disease, the animal may still be able to transmit virus and be infected. Passive immunization with a neutralizing monoclonal antibody is a very interesting possibility for SARS, and antibody-dependent enhancement is a problem with feline coronaviruses. So these are the research problems that I think will need to be addressed in the meeting this afternoon. Thank you.
Presentation by Dr. Denison from Vanderbilt University. Mark?
Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank Dr. Fauci, Dr. Montagne, and the organizers of this meeting for this invitation. Certainly, I've come as an ambassador from the coronavirus field, and there are many, many people here who could give this exact same talk. In fact, I want to embarrass them tremendously. I would like all of you who work on coronaviruses, who have worked on them or work on them currently or funded to work on them, please stand up for just a second. Come on, Susan, everybody stand up for just a second. I want you to recognize these people because these are the ones who will be in your breakout groups, many of whom flew back from Holland just to be here for this meeting. And I don't think Paul Masters stood up over there, but he's over there too. I saw you, Paul. I want to talk very quickly, go through the molecular biology of coronaviruses. I drew this graphic many years ago when I was young and had time, and no one ever cared. But it was my view that this was basically my view of the genome, and I know this is being webcast, but worse things are said on television, and I call this slide the genome from hell. And the reason I did that was because at 32 kb and without a system for directed genetic manipulation, answering many of these questions was just pretty much impossible. And so now we're in a much different position, and I think in light of the tremendously sobering presentations that we heard in the first half, I think we can certainly give a lot of cautionary tales from the genetics, but I think we can also draw a lot of hope from the fact that at the same time there's a confluence of many issues related to our ability to do direct genetics and understand the molecular biology. So I hope to take just a few minutes and take you on a biological tour that I hope you can see is relevant to the kinds of issues that you're trying to address. I do want to thank the NIH for 18 years of support. I want to also say that they have been very insightful in studying the animal coronaviruses in absence of an important human disease. And so you want me to say that again a little louder? The value of basic research, okay? And let me just put, I may not get to my talk. Let me put this investment in perspective. The total, I did a calculation based on some numbers I saw in the paper on the cost of the country of Canada and the country of China. The NIH's investment was, over the last 20 years, was less than the daily cost of this epidemic worldwide. So if you want to know the value of basic research, that's it in a nutshell. So my objectives today are to not going to review this in detail because of our time constraints, but just give you an understanding of the interface. I think I can do this without that. The interface between research, the pandemic potential, and the biology. Talk about the life cycle briefly, review the molecular biology, and then summarize research priorities in molecular biology and genetics. So this is my schematic of three things. One is a virus with incredible pandemic potential. It scares me. okay? And it scares everybody here, and I think we should be scared about that, and that's why you're all here, with incredible pandemic potential. But, you know, when people ask me, why is this so important, so many people die of flu, I say, well, we are never going to experience what SARS really could have done because of this incredible interaction of public health response that we've had. And those are the heroes who've gone there at their own risk to deal with this epidemic. But in addition, we have a background of research which allowed this to be rapidly identified. So what I'd like to see is this concept that we have limited human disease. In fact, what I'd like to see is the research and the public health interacting with this dangerous virus to come up with basically no human disease, new models for detection and global public health intervention with emerging infections, a new understanding of coronavirus ecology, evolution, replication, pathogenesis, and potential for human disease, and the new models for antivirals and vaccines. So I'm going to give you one slide on the relationship of SARS to coronaviruses, okay? And it's from my own little corner. So, you know, each coronavirus person has a hammer, and so everything they see is a nail, okay? And my nail is the replicase protein, and I'm only going to show you one slide on it very quickly. This is mouse hepatitis virus that I show. This is my career in one slide, okay? Working on the replicase gene, and Susan Baker can appreciate this. It's her career too, and this is what we've done, worked on where are the cleavage sites, what are the proteins, and how do they work. But basically, this is an outline of the replicase polyprotein. You know, coronaviruses do things large. Largest RNA virus, replicase polyprotein, most proteins. Okay, so coronavirus, just say most and largest, and you'll be right. But this shows some of the proteins that are made, including 3 proteinases, PLP1, PLP2, and 3CL-Pro, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, and the helicase. 2 small proteins at the amino terminus, and the vertical lines represent cleavage sites in the polyprotein. So let me just show you what SARS looks like in the replicase. So this is why many people, including myself, have argued that, in fact, this is a group 2 outlier that went and lived somewhere for a long time. And so when you look at the replicase, in fact, there are cleavage sites, there are proteinases. SARS seems to have dispensed with one of those. But the general organization is highly retained. In fact, the proteins are highly retained across, particularly the white and red regions downstream, highly retained. And so it gives us hope that many of the things we've done, for example, antibodies that we've developed against MHV replicase proteins may be effective actually in identifying or detecting some of these proteins. And so that's work that we have ongoing right now. But I don't put this up for my work. I put it up to show you that these relationships that were previously shown of SARS to other coronaviruses suggest, in fact, that some of the ones, particularly group 2, may be useful models, because when you look at those overall relationships, what you see is a split-off of the family at some point, which suggests that these were early group 2 splits. And so some of the things we study in detail in mice, in BL2, may be models that may be very effective in terms of understanding drugs, vaccine approaches, and molecular biology of SARS. So in terms of their overall thing, this has been reviewed by Kay already. I won't spend time on it. I'll just read them. The issues of general biology, the themes, the cautionary tales, are recurrent and repeat infections, prolonged or persistent virus shedding, cross-species infection in culture and in animals, rapid adaptation and emergence of new variants, and changes in disease and transmission. The correlative themes between molecular biology are a high mutation rate. So for those of you who aren't scientists, 1 change every 10,000 bases, theoretically, or 3 changes in every single genome. And if you have a viral yield of about 6 logs in an infection, that's a lot of changes. Now, most of those are never seen. They never will emerge. They may not be viable. But the potential is there for rapid adaptation. In addition, as Kay mentioned, homologous recombination. These viruses specialize in this as part of their life cycle. Finally, they appear to be able to recover their virulence from very deleterious mutations that are performed upon them. And they also, now the genetics are being done, we're finding that they tolerate deletions, mutations, substitutions, gene order rearrangements, all kinds of bad things in terms of their viability. This is both bad news and good news in terms of our ability to perhaps do things to get to vaccines. So now I want to talk about the life cycle briefly and replication as it relates to these issues that you want to address today. So Kay has reviewed this, but I did it with an animation, you know, so it's much more impressive that way now. Actually not. So the virus enters perhaps by 2 mechanisms. One is direct fusion with the plasma membrane, or potentially by receptor-mediated endocytosis. Following attachment and entry, the virus forms replication complexes. These have been shown by Susan Baker and by others to form on double membrane vesicles, possibly in interaction with the host cell pathways such as cellular autophagy. Replication complexes then are formed by probably every one of those replicase proteins that are processed in a massive complex on vesicles that may be induced by the virus. But they basically are the factories where everything is done. You know, it's the one-stop shopping factory where translation of proteins, processing, and then RNA synthesis occurs. Following that RNA synthesis, somehow RNA has to get to sites of assembly, which are in the Golgi intermediate compartment, and viruses bud intracellularly, and then are released by an exocytic process that typically doesn't involve cell lysis but results in high amounts of virus in the supernatant. So, following those issues, what I want to show you now, because it's late in the morning and everybody needs a break, is basically a movie of this, because everybody wants movies. So what happens is that the virus on the surface of the cell, there's cell-associated virus. There is also S protein on the surface that can interact with receptors. So this fusion event can be recapitulated in a cell-cell interaction, and that's what this movie is. So these are DBT cells that have been infected, and this is 5 hours post-infection. In my hubris, this was actually the time in the morning when I was taking this picture. I don't know why I put that on there, but it's really 5 hours post-infection. And if you watch the cells, you'll see them go from single cells into fused cells. So if you watch cells move around in culture very nicely, they divide, they do things. But if you watch over here, you'll see them lose their cell membrane and begin to fuse together into syncytia. This you can see up here as well with the division of cells, fusion, loss of the cell membrane, cytopathic effect, the recruitment of cells into the syncytium. It's a dramatic effect occurring in about 2 or 3 hours in mouse hepatitis virus. And the reason I put this up is because I think it may be relevant to our understanding. If when you look at those pathology specimens and you see multinucleated cells, I've had arguments, I can tell you not on how many papers, what's the relevance of syncytia? We don't see it in mouse hepatitis virus disease. Well, we see it in SARS disease. And so this process may be one that's important to the pathology. So what I want to show you now is just quickly what these look like so you can see a cell. Basically, I'm going to show you what the replication complexes look like. Okay, so here they are. These are cells in syncytia and not fused together. This is a label for one of the replicase proteins showing this punctate perinuclear pattern of these multiple factories in the cytoplasm. It's easier to see this when you take a cell and you do a couple labeled proteins and then you reconstruct the cell in 3 dimensions. And I hope. All right, you're out of time. Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Okay. But that just shows, I will just show that just a second, that just shows these multiple replication factories in the host cell cytoplasm surrounding the nucleus and basically filling up the cell over time. Okay. So now, in terms of the life cycle, what's the relevance of all this to the issues today? You've heard many of the issues related to the replication and recombination. This is why those processes occur, and these are some of the steps that could be interfered with. This is the genome, 32 kb, mouse hepatitis virus, multiple downstream genes with transcriptional regulatory sequences, or TRSs. When the virus comes into the cell, the replicase gene, or gene 1, is translated into the large polyprotein. Actually 2, but I'm showing it as 1. Following, it contains multiple domains, including 3 proteinases. Those proteinases act on itself, basically an autocatalytic process, to cleave those into the mature proteins that then do functions in the cell. Now, SARS contains 2 of these proteinases and all these cleavage sites, so likely does the same thing. Following that, replication complexes are formed, which then direct the synthesis of this nested set of subgenomic RNAs that Kay talked about, with the 5' most genes exposed for translational purposes of structural and non-structural proteins. These then replication may be mediated off of the intermediate template in terms of new genome, and together those things go to form new virus particles. I just want to show you one example of a potential for interference. That is, if we block this process, we showed with mouse hepatitis virus, if you block this process of protein expression or processing, basically within 20 minutes you shut down this whole process. And here's just one example. This is a drug called E64D, which was added. This is RNA synthesis in mouse hepatitis virus infected cells. Addition of this proteinase, this general proteinase inhibitor basically will completely abort it if it's added at the beginning. But more impressive, it'll abort it if it's added later or even later. Sorry, that went the wrong way. Abort it even later. So this may be a very vulnerable step in the life cycle of viruses, protein processing. In terms of the different events, I want to show you just one process, and that is during replication of the virus, the formation of subgenomic RNAs, where you begin a transcriptional event of the negative strand, And then there's an event where the polymerase is able to jump or switch templates to pick up a leader from the 5' end of the genome. This results in a subgenomic RNA with that leader. So this is why polymerase switching, template switching is important and recombination occurs, leading to subgenomic RNAs and then this whole nested set, as was described before. So now I want to go on and talk just about the genetics of the viruses before I summarize. So again, they're general themes: largest RNA genomes, an error-prone polymerase that makes lots of mistakes but benefits from it, polymerase switching and recombination, recovery of virulence following deleterious changes, and the mutability and the plasticity of the genome. And Kay has already covered some of these natural variants that we can use for genetic analysis. And let me just do a theme here. I'll just do it at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And that theme is sequencing. There have been more coronavirus sequenced in the last month than there were in the previous 25 years, from my estimate. Okay? So when people ask me questions, I say, I don't know, sequence more. And that's very true. This is not an expensive, it's very expensive for a little old lab, country virologist like myself. But as a process, in terms of understanding targets and in terms of identifying transmission and changes, it's a very, very cost-effective strategy. 32,000 bases is large for me. It's not large if we think of the overall contribution of already available strains and variants. Okay, so if you want one of my research priorities, that would be it. So these natural variants, these changes may tell us very much about what we're thinking about with SARS. Second, temperature-sensitive mutants. Multiple panels of these have been developed and are available. What don't we know? Well, with one exception of one paper that was published in one of our symposia, we know nothing about the determinants that made those temperature sensitive. So if you want vaccine candidates that may be stable, grow well in culture at cool temperatures, but be potentially good for attenuated replication, that's a good place to start, and I'd like to see those sequenced. Vaccine strains, passage in culture and in animals, UV chemical, cold, and cell mixing, all have been used for developing vaccine strains. Guess what? Haven't been sequenced for the most part. Okay? Very good viruses, many of them good candidates. So this is an issue, I think, in terms of genetic analysis that may be very rapid and yield a great deal of information. So in terms of other genetic analyses, there you go, I have it right at the top. Sequence the viruses, the variants, and the mutants. And then we come to reverse genetics. We can now do these experiments. How do we do these experiments? Well, Kay already covered targeted recombination, so let me just tell you why it's a good system. It takes advantage of the high rate of homologous recombination. It's a powerful selection system for mutations with growth on specific cells. It's applicable mostly to the 3' 10 kb because this is where the most recombination occurs. It includes all structural and non-structural proteins, so it grabs a whole bunch of stuff that y'all are interested in. And finally, it has been well utilized for studies of the S, M, N, and E genes. So this system is very powerful. So what do we do then with other reverse genetic approaches? Well, Ralph Barrick has developed a system in his laboratory for doing this with mouse hepatitis virus, and it's very negotiable or useful for many purposes. It starts with the genome RNA. It's been cloned as a series of cassettes, of stable cassettes of DNA that eliminate toxicity and make it more stable. These DNA pieces then are cut out and via, I think, a marvelous strategy can be ligated in a directional strategy that doesn't form concatemers but gives you a full-length DNA in vitro. Off of that, you drive transcription in vitro in the same reaction mix, come up with a full-length genome RNA, get it into cells, and you get virus out. The beauty of this and the opportunities are that if you introduce a mutation in here, you can know which one it's in. You don't have to work with the whole system, and it's quite flexible to come up with a mutation. In fact, you can develop a library of mutations in different cassettes. You can mix and match those and begin to look at those strategies in great detail if you're trying to look at perhaps combinations for attenuation of viruses for vaccines. So these are the strategies. Then infectious clones are now available for MHV, IBV, TGV, and the human coronavirus using in vitro assembly, vaccinia recombinants, or bacterial artificial chromosomes. The potential for these is that they're applicable to the whole entire genome, and that there's examples already of mutations via this system that have yielded viable viruses. Gene deletions, gene duplications, gene substitutions, gene order rearrangements, and replicase polyprotein cleavage site deletions. So there are many, many things that can be done with this. And so recommendation 2, support genetic studies, development of infectious clone technology, and study of mutations. So what is our application to SARS? Well, the genome organization, proteins, replication strategies are likely retained. The requirements for cell entry, protein expression and processing, RNA synthesis, and virus assembly are likely retained. They have a close relationship, a closest relationship to group 2 coronaviruses, and there may be animal models within this that we can immediately begin to study for SARS coronavirus. And finally, we can begin to, by sequencing, by developing these genetic approaches, integrate natural variation, variants, and other things. So recommendations: sequence, lab clinical isolates of human, mammalian, and avian coronaviruses, and Kay Holm also said lizards and birds. Okay, so I'd like to see those too. Identify new ones. Longitudinally track database, establish a database, and analyze isolates. Develop reverse genetic systems for SARS coronavirus. Clone and express the proteins and receptors for antibodies, functional studies, and inhibition. And define the cell biology of SARS coronavirus. Define the interactions in the host cell. There may be simple strategies for blocking their ability to move through a cell and use the cell machinery. And then finally, define that, replication complexes and mechanisms of cell death. And with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention and for this invitation. Thank you.
Dr. Castle, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. Mark, you gave a great example of the rewards for investment in basic research in the animal coronaviruses. And another good reason for that investment, as you know, is because so many of the commercial and institutionally maintained mouse colonies are naturally infected with MHV, and we've learned a lot, actually, from the natural history of that disease. And one of the analogies that you didn't comment on, or potential analogies, is the altered immune responsiveness that results to unrelated antigens and infectious agents when your animal colonies are infected with MHV. I wonder if there's any extrapolation, or if you could comment on what we know today about the mechanism of that immunosuppression, primarily most of the time, if I remember correctly. I'm also aware of work done at Yale by some of Bob Jacoby's group in the comparative medicine years ago that showed and documented intrauterine transmission of MHV, and persistence obviously is a huge issue with MHV. And how do you think that's going to extrapolate, if at all?
I think you have addressed those things very well. I just make a couple comments. When I first saw the first reports of lymphopenia, my very first thoughts were these issues of immunosuppression, alteration to other infections, and the potential interactions that actually SARS might be causing with other pathogens. Second one, in terms of human disease and transmission, I've been in touch with the people in Toronto, Stan Reed, Brodovich, that group, and one of the questions they asked me was this issue of potential for maternal infant transmission. I think that remains to be determined whether there is actually a viremia, if it's substantial, and there may be some other barriers to that, or in terms of perinatal transmission. So I think some of these things indicate that, yeah, those are issues that very much need to be addressed, and those are part of the pathogenesis and pathophysiology that we need to study.
Over here.
Thank you for those compelling insights from biology. I wonder if each of you can comment on what you know about the biology of the coronaviruses that would help explain the phenomena of super spreading events in terms of efficiency of infection. Are there characteristics that you've seen either in other coronaviruses or potential explanations from the molecular perspective?
There isn't another example, excuse me, that's exactly like a super spreader phenomenon. Many of these viruses are extremely good spreaders all by themselves in their natural hosts. And I think we've been fortunate that SARS is not a better spreader in general, because as Gail has alluded to, one mouse hepatitis virus infected mouse in a colony with an enterotropic strain can infect practically all of the mice and cause devastating losses financially. So what we do know is that there are terrific interactions of other coronaviruses with different types of infections, parasitic, viral, and bacterial infections, but I don't know about the super spreader phenomenon.
I think that's. I think that characterizes it quite well. We do see transmission. I think there are, one of the things that you think about on your list of cautionary tales or concerns, that people have asked, is this issue of intergroup or intergroup recombination and the ability to acquire different mechanisms of transmission. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at in culture or potentially in animals
to see that as we sort of move forward with things like vaccine approaches.
Yes, sir.
Gus Kusulas from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. Dr. Holmes, thank you for mentioning the work by Hans Storz on bovine coronavirus. And also, I thank Mark for pitching for the support from NIH on animal viruses. We see how important it becomes now. With regard to bovine coronaviruses, I wanted to point out that Hans Storz and his team at Louisiana State University described really what I perhaps and you can forgive me for that, I could call a cow SARS syndrome. We did describe acute lethal pneumonia, interstitial pneumonia in cattle in the absence, or at least at the beginning, the absence of bacterial infections. If you look at the mortality rate, there were 10% of those cows that died very quickly. The good thing about those episodics that we described in 98, 99 was that a lot of animals survived, and those had high humoral immunity early on, as well as most likely a fairly good cellular immunity as evidenced, but at least the having IgG2 type of response may be more relevant in terms of a Th1 types of response. So at least the bovine coronavirus, there is at least one model of acute pneumonia in an animal species, and this is the bovine coronavirus.
Thank you very much. Bob?
I want to start off by saying I spent a lot of my time in my career working on influenza and common cold viruses, and I have to start out by differing with Dr. Denison that 10 to 30% of colds in humans is unimportant. But
okay, I'm a pediatric infectious disease person. I've used that argument in every single grant I've ever written, so I agree with you 100%. All right.
I would say you just have the wrong set of reviewers.
Maybe other people than me thought they were unimportant.
You need a new set of reviewers. I want to see if I can get you to comment on this crescendo illness, which, as Dr. Parra pointed out, is unlike the acute respiratory virus infections. That's not characteristic. In actual fact, it's similar to one we worry about, and that's mycoplasma pneumoniae, which has that same kind of crescendo circumstance. What do you think? Replication time? This is not an upper respiratory disease initially. Are we waiting for that growth to get to the target organ in the lung? Are we mutating to get to that point? Are we waiting for an immune response to occur to enhance that uptake and produce the disease? Are we losing innate? You can propose a lot of options. You're the coronavirologist. Speculate for us.
Well, one good thing about the absence of data is you can speculate all you want. Well, you have just defined the research agenda for these important questions. And I have been promulgating a model because I like to throw out what I call straw viruses. And that is that this is, in fact, a systemic disease with a progressive respiratory component.
Yeah.
And
Q fever.
I'm sorry?
Q fever, if you would.
Q fever, measles, a serious disease in adults, mild disease in children. Evidence from the animal models, preliminary, that IV inoculation may lead to pneumonia. I think that there's a lot of things that make us think just because you can't measure viremia doesn't mean it hasn't had a viremic phase and that it hasn't spread. And so I think that's a very important thing to pursue, understanding this as a systemic disease with a respiratory component.
And needless to say, that relates very specifically to those immune correlates that we want for that vaccine or the protection.
Critical.
Kay, do you want to comment on that?
So how and where in the cell do these messages get capped if this is a cytoplasmic virus? And is that tail polyadenylation, or is that just on the viral genome?
They're capped in the replication complex by the viral replicase in the cytoplasm.
So it has a capping?
Yeah. And the poly A is added in the cytoplasm also.
It has a polyadenylation?
Yes.
Protein. Okay.
I'm an HIV and T-cell immunologist, so the questions that I'm going to ask you kind of come from that corner. I wondered if we can learn from previous experience in coronavirus vaccine development. What I understood you guys to say was that the live attenuated vaccines were better than killed vaccines, and that suggests that there probably is some kind of a cell-mediated component. I wondered whether you had, or anyone had looked at B-cell deficient or T-cell deficient animal models I also wondered whether it was appropriate to focus so much on the spike, because what you showed is when you change the target tissue in the pig disease, that probably was a spike effect, but you got protection from the enteric disease in the pigs with pneumonia, which suggests probably also that there might be a cell-mediated a kind of response which would be cross-species. And that might be very important to consider in vaccines.
I think the best studied examples for the immunology are in the mouse hepatitis virus system. And indeed, there are many correlates of the immune response with disease. So, for example, the demyelination that's found in the central nervous system disease is correlated with an immune response to virus infection. And it is really clear that you need cytotoxic T cells to eliminate virus infection, but that antibody also can play a role. But I think the central thing that should be the take-home message for the immune response to these viruses is the problem that they have such a habitat of living in mucosal cells in the respiratory and enteric tract. And so what you really need to prevent infection is mucosal immunity, which is short-lived. And even if you have mucosal immunity in the respiratory tract from a respiratory infection, the animals can still continue to shed from the fecal route for long periods. And so you have several things that you want to accomplish with your vaccine. One is to prevent serious lower respiratory tract disease, and it may be that IgG will be an appropriate vaccine result that you will want that will prevent that. But to prevent infection, which is also tremendously important because of the epidemiological problems that we've seen, special emphasis is going to have to be placed on the mucosal immune responses.
Can I just ask, what about the variation problem that was seen in, I think, it was the dog vaccine and other vaccines? There's a lot of variation in the different strains, so one vaccine does not protect against the other strains.
This varies considerably from one coronavirus to another. For example, there's a single monoclonal antibody that blocks infection with all strains of transmissible gastroenteritis virus. That's not true for mouse hepatitis virus. They all use the same receptor, but they have potentially more variation in the spike. IBV has a very variable spike glycoprotein in terms of antigens, but 229E has been stable as far as we've sequenced about 14 strains, just their spike protein. Since 1968, the virus has been quite stable in its spike. So I think there's a good deal of variation in that huge protein of how many antigenic sites there may be.
I think I'm going to have to take the chairman's prerogative and bring this to a close. We're going to run out of time otherwise. So if you could pursue these questions privately with the speakers, I think that would be appreciated. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.
This has been a most extraordinary day. I think a spectacularly successful conference and workshop. What we're going to do right now is to have the individual, there are a couple of chairs, we're going to have one of the representative chairs of the breakout groups come up and to give a brief summary report on the deliberations of the individual and respective breakout groups. So I'd like to ask John LaMontagne to come up and take the responsibility of introducing the co-chairs or the chair so that we can have a presentation and then some discussion.
Thank you, Tony. We'd like to start with vaccines, and let me ask Dr. Haynes. Bart?
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank John and the other organizers of the meeting for the opportunity to participate. I too think the meeting has been absolutely spectacular. Bob Couch and I led the discussion in the vaccine breakout group. And the group worked very hard, following two superb presentations by Ralph Barrick and Karen Milhoot from the FDA. And we dealt with the issues that were assigned to us, number one being what scientific and technical barriers must be overcome to develop a safe and effective SARS vaccine. And first and foremost, Ralph and a number of other coronavirus experts recommended studying pathogenesis for the benefit of vaccine development as the empiric approach moves along in parallel. And so certainly we must understand the pathogenesis of SARS. That is it more like murine hepatitis virus versus a feline infectious peritonitis virus? Studies in humans are important to define the correlates and determinants of immunity in survivors in both children and adults. And folks picked up on the clinical observation that children do much better than adults with the disease. And to begin the process of identifying disease protective versus disease predisposition genes. We need to develop large and small animal models of SARS. This is, of course, very important for vaccine development and in order for vaccine protection studies, and to define the correlates of immunity to SARS. Continue the work on development of the SARS animal model in primates. And a number of investigators mentioned that of the animal viruses, respiratory bovine coronavirus syndrome, or the SARS-like severe pneumonitis in cows, as well as MHV, for a variety of reasons, appear to be very important models to pay attention to. And it's essential to sample and monitor the biodiversity and evolution of the animal and human coronaviruses, because the coronaviruses can jump from animals to man and man to animals, as a number of folks have pointed out. Next, it's important to develop immune monitoring assays that are standardized for vaccine trials, as well as center on neutralization assays. It was pointed out that NIAID has already begun to support the development of T-cell overlapping peptides for the SARS virus, for all of the proteins, and these will be available to the community, and high-throughput neutralization assays are needed. We need to understand the cellular and molecular mechanisms of cross-species infectious potential of the coronaviruses. And finally, a number of folks pointed out that the research community needs to move as fast as possible and to learn from prior animal pandemics of coronaviruses. And Ralph Barrick pointed out at least 4 pandemics that have occurred in animals over the past 20 years. And finally, we need to define the SARS host co-receptors and receptors, as Kay Holmes pointed out, involved in entry and fusion, and center on structural studies for both, not only for vaccines, but for pathogenesis and drug development, but certainly for vaccines, particularly if neutralizing antibodies do turn out to be important and not enhancing for the SARS virus, a point that we don't know yet. And then we come to the empiric SARS vaccine approach with the question what SARS vaccine approaches should be pursued in the short term and in the long term. And here we neither had the time nor the inclination to prioritize, although it was recognized that the most successful vaccines have been live attenuated. And Ralph and Mark Denison during the day have talked about reverse genetics as well as targeted RNA recombination as ways to develop live attenuated vaccines. It was also noted that a number of investigators both here and around the world are developing killed and activated vaccines, and hopefully these should be in clinical trials in a relatively short period of time. We talked about vectored methods for inducing T-cell responses with examples of DNA prime and adeno boost or MVA boost that are being approached here at the NIH. Vectored for neutralizing antibody responses, vectored and adjuvanted for long-lived protective mucosal immune responses, because so many of these agents, including SARS, because SARS interacts with the mucosal immune system. There was less enthusiasm for subunit-based vaccines, but we decided not to eliminate them from the list at this early stage in the game, and virus-like particle approaches were also cited as promising. With regard to questions for a rational approach, we listed a number of questions which, in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on. Are existing scientific and technical resources adequate to expeditiously make a safe and effective SARS vaccine? So what about the infrastructure? And the need for reagent repository was repetitively mentioned. Standardized reagents widely available from the beginning. Recombinant proteins, monoclonal antibodies, plasmids, human sera in particular, to be made available, particularly in areas where, fortunately, the virus has not made a huge dent, such as in the United States, but where a number of investigators are interested in performing research. several folks indicated the need for compendium databases on T-cell and B-cell epitopes such as available for AIDS, and a coronavirus sequence database that would follow the evolution of the virus and tie in with the biodiversity initiative of surveying the biodiversity of coronaviruses in both animals and humans in order to be able to anticipate what might be coming down the pike next. And the need for BSL-3 facilities for live SARS virus work was discussed, as well as the development of SOPs for working with patient sera as well as patient cells in various laboratories. And it was also noted that NIAID and other agencies have already made quite a bit of progress in this regard. We had a great discussion about the licensing issues from Karen at the FDA, and some of the issues that came up were with regard to a live attenuated, given that there was a lot of enthusiasm for the concept of live attenuated, but also a lot of good dose of realism about the regulatory issues, including the issue of revertance to virulence and the issue of transmission, given some of the experiences in the animal diseases. The issue of vaccine-induced disease enhancement was brought up, and everyone has a great deal of both trepidation with the glasses half empty, but enthusiasm because there are a number of coronaviruses for which vaccines have been protective. But we need to be mindful of antibody-dependent enhancement of disease, and particularly in the animal models as this goes forward. How and where efficacy in humans will be evaluated simply needs to be addressed, and for whom will the vaccine be recommended, certainly hospital workers at this particular point. And then what about the licensing issues and barriers? We had a nice discussion. The FDA requests for investigators to meet early and meet often on all aspects. I think the SARS epidemic has been a sentinel event, not only because of the seriousness of the epidemic, but because of the enormous amount of collaboration that has been present from the get-go. And so we recommended the formation of a continued coordinated scientific collaborative network. I think we should be able to see the strength of global collaboration and cooperation and sharing of data and reagents, with a national and international coordinated effort to work together to solve the SARS vaccine problems and to work to move multiple vaccine strategies into clinical trials as soon as possible. This, of course, success will be predicated on having government, academic, and industry partnerships, and it is very gratifying that at this meeting these three partners are so equally represented. There need to be teams to begin working on intellectual property issues from the get-go so that the partners can work smoothly with regard to sharing of information and to bring the best candidates rapidly to clinical trial without needless duplication of efforts. And finally, production facilities for vaccines for multiple simultaneous clinical trials need to be thought about, whether from public or private sources, so that when good, promising vaccines come out of preclinical studies, they'll have a place to be rapidly made. And finally, inclusion of contacts and staff of regulatory agencies like the FDA in the teams need to be made from the get-go, and we need to begin to develop clinical trials capacity, which can likely be superimposed on existing NIAID as well as CDC and other existing clinical trials units, so that promoting the concept of multitasking clinical trials unit development. And that's where we got.
I think we should maybe just entertain a couple of questions. Jim?
I'd just like to make a comment. My name's Jim LeDuc. I'm from CDC. I wanted to make sure that those interested in vaccines are aware that we have taken raw clinical material from a specimen of a known patient, isolated it under GMP conditions in certified cells and passed it, and that virus will be available for vaccine manufacturers within about a week or two at max. So that material is available. You just contact CDC and we'll work out the arrangements.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Bart. Our next report is on antivirals, and it will be presented by Dr. Dolan. Ray?
Thank you. We had a very lively session in our discussion of antivirals, which was co-chaired by Marty Hirsch and myself, and for which Kathy Laughlin served as rapporteur. We raised a number of the questions that have already been addressed by the vaccine group in Bart's presentation, so I'll try to go over these quickly. The discussion consisted of a presentation by John Huggins, who reviewed the current state of our knowledge about antivirals, and by a presentation by Mark Goldberger from FDA, who discussed issues for the development of antivirals from the FDA's point of view. John Huggins pointed out the active antiviral screening program, which is present. It's supported by USAMRIID, NIID, and CDC. And this is an assay which he described as low to moderate throughput. It's a tissue culture-based assay in Vero 76 cells, and has now looked at least in the low throughput version more than 100 compounds, and in the moderate throughput, which requires a combination of drugs, looked at simultaneously tens of thousands of compounds. So there's been a great deal of activity even at this point. In answer to one of the questions posed to the group, it was clear that a truly high throughput assay would be of great interest, something that would either improve the optics of the tissue culture assay, which is based on neutral red dye exclusion, and or something along the kin of a luciferase assay, which really would enable high throughput, high precision kinds of assays to be put through. Now, with the current assays, however, some information has emerged, which was shared with our group. Some activity has against SARS coronavirus has been demonstrated for alpha and beta interferons, possibly at the very borderline of the levels that might be achieved currently from our knowledge of safety and pharmacokinetics. Some activity against birimantadine against SARS coronavirus, again at the very highest level of what might be achievable in terms of pharmacokinetics in humans, and also some activity by cysteine proteinase inhibitors. So at least at this point in time, there are hints that there may be some activity by those classes of compounds. Ribavirin has not fared well in this assay and was felt to be inactive with EIC 50s of greater than 250 micrograms per ml, and multiple analyses of this failed to elicit any activity for ribavirin. The analogous levels of activity in clinical situations where ribavirin has been effective are about tenfold lower, in the realm of 20 to 40 micrograms per ml. There are many other compounds and classes that are under study. These are at this point proprietary in nature, and so John could not go into the details. But it's a very active area, and that there are now novel MTA and CRADAs that have been developed to protect the sponsor's intellectual property. So we were left with the impression that this is in fact a very active area of which already a fair amount of work has been done. In terms of important steps for the development of an antiviral, the group felt that animal models would be essential, and practical animal models of the type that, again, can be used in standard developmental processes. Clearly, some progress has been made with the establishment of possible primate models for SARS coronavirus infection. And though these may be very useful at some point, they're clearly don't take the place of a small animal model, and particularly a rodent. And so the group had some discussion about the relevance of currently established models, rodent models, with coronaviruses that are clearly different from SARS coronavirus. For example, the mouse hepatitis virus, which has, as we heard this morning, clearly some important similarities and analogies to SARS coronavirus, but is nonetheless clearly a different animal model. But the utility of that versus trying to establish a distinct animal-rodent model, such as the one in cotton rats, it is reasonable that one should go forward with both of these streams of investigation and recognize that different models may be important for different questions, particularly as they relate to issues of pathogenesis. It was also pointed out in the discussion that, at least from one set of studies from Dr. Sidwell and his colleagues, agents which seem to be active against other human coronaviruses, for example, OC43, turn out not to be active against the SARS coronavirus in the viral cell model. The group recognized that it's going to be very important to expedite the development process, and that the identification of an in vitro, a drug or a compound that may be active in vitro is barely the start of this process. And so it would be clearly important to identify mechanisms for the support for preclinical studies, whether these include some necessary medicinal chemistry or preclinical toxicology, that it would be very important to engage this process in a very early and effective manner to support studies, so that a drug or a potential drug or a compound that shows activity in vitro doesn't languish because the next steps, which are often very expensive and laborious, can't be taken. We did have the statement from individuals from several pharmaceutical houses who were present who stated their interest in pursuing potentially active drugs against SARS coronavirus, even though that the clear-cut imperative of market attractions may not be present. So I think that the opportunity to engage that interest and at the same time to provide some resources to support the preclinical studies is an important window in moving the field forward. This is what is meant by the last bullet point in part, to provide the incentives to pharma to pursue the development of these drugs. From Mark Goldberger's presentation, it was also clear that early involvement of the FDA, both in specific pre-IND discussions, but it also in planning subsequent development of candidate antivirals would be very useful. And then finally, the group also believed that it would be important to be ready clinically to evaluate in a rigorous and systematic way the effectiveness of a candidate antiviral, and that the group should be the field should be ready to examine a drug in established protocols that can be implemented efficiently, and that would be available locally in the sites where SARS diseases would be prevalent, and that this would require an enhancement and continued support of international collaborations. There are such protocols now that have been established by the CASG and by other groups, and I think it's a question of having those either in place or in a position to be put in place readily when a potentially attractive antiviral would be developed through this process. So that was what our group had to say.
Thanks, Ray. Are there any questions for this group? Bob?
I just want to make one comment and then maybe two comments, was that I was in the vaccine session by assignment, but I think antivirals deserve the highest of priorities, along with diagnosis perhaps, and maybe even more so than vaccines right now, because not only can you hopefully have the ability to treat what's hit in the hospital, but this crescendo illness gives you a window perhaps of opportunity to treat at an early level to prevent that severe disease that we don't ordinarily think of that we have with the acute respiratory viruses. And all of this close contact, is just built for a safe prophylactic to be used in the close contact circumstance. So I would give this the highest of endorsement. Second comment is that you didn't say it specifically, but I think it surely would be there, is that the way that currently, you don't just screen. We got to do structure-based drug design. So the three-dimensional models and using that to facilitate the design of drugs would be an important item for your section 2, I would think.
Right. I think the group acknowledged that in terms of the type of drug and that should enter the screening process. That would be one source. And again, the availability of high throughput, precisely quantifiable assays, such as, again, a luciferase assay, would really facilitate that.
Gail?
With all the caveats for potential adverse impact of use of antibodies, it seems to me from looking at treatment that it probably makes a lot more sense to tackle the antibody issue first and foremost, because it can be done much more rapidly and I think less expensively than developing an antiviral, just based on, I think a lot of experience now. And I wonder how your group would rank, antibodies as potential therapies, use in prophylaxis, i.e. the RSV experience, as compared to development of antivirals.
We didn't really get to the point to discuss. There was a lot of discussion about the whole question of pathogenesis and whether there was an immunopathogenesis component that may be equally important in terms of effective treatment. That is, an antiviral that might inhibit the replication of the virus and something that would modulate the immune response. My own answer to that question is that I think it would be very useful to have an specific antibody to be tested, an effectively neutralizing antibody, for example. That may be the most potent antiviral that you can start off with.
Thanks.
You may?
Yeah, I would suggest an area like specific immunoglobulin and as a therapy, and also since the SARS has the pathogenesis, especially immunopathology, play an important role. So might be systematical way to check the cytokine profile and find some specific branch which maybe develop antagonist as a treatment approach.
Well, that may be one advantage of having these detailed protocols that can be implemented, where even in the absence of an effective antiviral, you'll get some natural history of pathogenesis data that would address that.
I think there are a lot of anti-inflammatories that are being developed for a number of reasons, and that those might be also worthy of trial as soon as you have a good animal model system.
Thank you very much, Ray. I think we should move on to the next group, which is the clinical research group, and Dr. Lane will make that presentation.
Thanks very much, John. I'd also like to thank my co-chair, Henry Mazur, our rapporteur, John Beigel, and Allison McGeer for her presentation during the session. We had a robust discussion with participation by many of the individuals who attended. we broke the discussion into multiple areas. Clinical manifestations, pathogenesis, virology, immunology, and treatment. And just wanted to hit some of the high points, some of the discussions we had in some of those areas. As we talked about clinical manifestations, we thought it would be important to try to develop some type of staging system that would take the range of clinical manifestations that can be seen in the setting of coronavirus infection and categorize them. This is obviously important from developing prognostic indicators as well as looking for evidence of disease progression in a uniform way as one develops interventional clinical trials. The second area was to try to identify predictors of disease progression. Just a couple of examples, looking at the role of host genetics and also looking at laboratory markers that might help predict a disease progression, whether those would be virologic, immunologic, or even nonspecific markers that would antedate clinical outcomes. Thirdly, as we heard this morning, there's an enormous amount of data being generated and coming forward in a longitudinal or cross-sectional fashion. We thought it would be important to have studies initiated that would give a longitudinal evaluation of patients, both clinically, immunologically, and virologically, not just for the short term, several weeks, but for months and, in fact, potentially years, insofar as we don't know the long-term consequences. So suggesting that at a minimum viral nucleic acids can be detected long-term, whether or not there may be additional long-term sequelae that we wouldn't see as early as possible if we did not have this type of long-term follow-up study in place. And then as a separate comment to make, the identification of certain cases as being super spreaders seemed to us to be a very important area to focus some energies, and if indeed there were individuals who had recovered, who were epidemiologically identified as super spreaders, to do some extensive evaluation of these individuals to try to see if there were any clues as to what separated them, say, from other individuals who had been infected with the SARS coronavirus. With regard, we folded our pathophysiology elements then into virology, immunology, and the earlier. With regard to virology, again, with the longitudinal types of studies, it was felt to be important to not just look at PCR, but also to develop techniques for repeated culturing, so we would have some idea of infectiousness and also perhaps, again, better early indicators of efficacy of drugs. The viral shedding we felt should be monitored from multiple sites, nasopharyngeal washes, blood, urine, stool. The data that we heard this morning regarding the potential for mutation and genetic variability within the SARS coronavirus, the fact that the single amino acid changes may lead to changes in cell tropism for the virus, were all areas of great interest to our group. We felt it would be important to see if there were any correlations between the types of viral quasi-species that could be identified with clinical manifestations of disease and or infectivity, to look to see if, as virus was found in different tissues, did it assume different characteristics, different genotypes. And then finally, under virology, again, given the fact that there does seem to be this propensity for this class of virus to undergo fairly extensive mutation, to look at the in vivo evolution of viruses, and also to have ready the development of assays for measuring resistance as new agents came into the clinic. With regard to immunology, again, the importance of generating information longitudinally on the development of both humoral and cellular immune responses and looking for any correlates that could be determined between clinical outcomes and these parameters of immune response. To look at the impact of infection with SARS virus on the immune response to other antigens, playing off the information from the murine hepatitis model. And then finally look at the role of the immune system itself in pathogenesis, both from the perspective of the inflammatory responses that may be occurring, particularly within the lung, and in addition, whether or not there was a mechanism that could be identified for the lymphoid cell depletion and the lymphopenia that has been reported. Finally, with regard to treatment, I think we're going to echo some of the things that Ray mentioned. We felt to deal effectively with a research treatment agenda, it would be very important to try and develop a coordinated global network for studying infectious diseases, because today, what will be SARS, tomorrow may be something else, and when you look at what we need to accomplish in clinical research, we can't always predict where the disease is going to show up, and I think SARS is a great example of where we have a disconnect between where there may be the ability to do sophisticated clinical research rapidly and where the epidemic is occurring. And I think if we can take steps to build a network, a global network that allows us to integrate multiple different communities in a rapid response fashion, as was mentioned by Bob and by Ray, to rapidly put protocols in place, rapidly change protocols as new information becomes available. I think that would be, we thought that would be key to developing an effective treatment research response. We felt that there were very little data upon which to make recommendations of where to go, but we certainly had consensus within the room that it made sense to look at initiating randomized controlled trials, one of hyperimmune immunoglobulin, a second with corticosteroids, and then obviously new agents as they are identified. We thought also, given the information about the course of the illness and the prolonged time of spread from infection, initial symptoms, and then serious manifestations, the timing needed to be a variable in trial design. Early intervention with an agent theoretically could be beneficial, whereas late intervention with that same agent could be a problem, and vice versa. So we thought time was a critical variable to put into any sort of clinical trial design. And then one, as the research moved along, look at the issue of post-exposure prophylaxis in addition to what one could do with established disease. And those were the comments from our group.
Are there any questions for Dr. Lane?
If I think this was implied in your virology comments, but I'd like to emphasize that, at least I think a number of us would agree that the desire for that quantitative virology in those individuals while they're experiencing illness. Granted, you've got to control for age and underlying disease, but if it fits that mold that we think of, a more infection equals more disease, then we've clearly got an antiviral and an immune target and a vaccine target that's less than total prevention. But if that doesn't fit, then we really got to worry about immunopathology, I'm afraid. So just that fundamental information might guide us a great deal.
Any other questions? The next group is epidemiology, and Dr. Hughes from CDC will present that. Jim?
Thank you, John. Before I begin, let me just take a moment and congratulate Tony and John and all of their colleagues for putting together on very short notice what I think everybody would agree has been a tremendous program today. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-chair, Rob Webster, and our rapporteur, Lune Simonson, who did yeoman's work to pull this presentation together. We began by hearing updates from Larry Anderson and Guan Yi, and then turned to a discussion of some of the epidemiologic issues. I can't resist the temptation to point out to you the recently published Institute of Medicine report called Microbial Threats to Health, Emergence, Detection, and Response. That report was issued by the Institute of Medicine on March 18th, about 4 days after the WHO global alert on SARS. This report is directly germane to many of the issues that we've been discussing today, so I think you'd find it of interest. Now, there are lots of unanswered questions. We covered a lot of ground. I apologize, we did not have time to prioritize these issues. We started by talking about the animal reservoir. Is there one? It appears that there are, more work needs to be done. Are there mutations associated with the apparent species jumping? What are they? What about virologic and environmental factors associated with introductions into humans? We need to know more about the molecular epidemiology of animal SARS viruses. How widespread are they in China and elsewhere? We need, as others have said, more information on quantitation of virus as it relates to infectivity of body fluids and tissues. We need to know more about relationship of domesticated and semi-domesticated animals and their importance in transmission. Are infected animals sick? Obviously, animal challenges need to be done, and animal models are clearly needed. Are animal SARS viruses candidates as a human vaccine? Is obviously the vaccine group focused on that issue much more than we did. Clearly, there's a need for more studies of the natural history of animal SARS infection in animal handlers in China. We, as well as others, were obviously intrigued by the serologic results that we heard this morning. Some more issues on natural history. Could blood donor specimens, if available, provide additional relevant information in China in particular, but perhaps in other areas as well? How long does antibody persist? We need to study specimens from individuals with mild disease. Risk factors and characteristics of super spreaders. We were also very interested in learning much more about super spreaders and super spreader events. Felt that perhaps case control studies could be helpful in this regard. There are obviously implications for control here. What about shedding? What about infectivity of these people? What about virus characteristics and host characteristics? Are immunocompromised people at increased risk of infection or severe disease? Do they have increased duration of shedding of virus, perhaps? What about host genetics, viral genetics versus environmental factors in these super spreading events? In some cases, nebulizers and intubation events have been important. In terms of spectrum and course of illness, what's the role of the immune response? There's some interesting clues so far, but more data are needed. What is the importance of co-infections? We focused a lot on SARS coronavirus, but we need to remember some of the initial observations regarding metapneumoviruses and chlamydia and keep an open mind in this regard. What about infectivity of blood, plasma, and tissues, perhaps even in a transplantation setting, harking back to some of the surprises of last year related to West Nile? We shouldn't forget about these. The role of diarrhea, why does the frequency of it seem to vary from place to place and setting to setting? Is this important in transmission? How important is it? What about reinfection? How long does immunity last? Is there CNS involvement? It would be nice in autopsy situations to look a little more closely at that question. What about long-term sequelae, both clinical and immunologic? And the issue of disease in children, why is it less severe? What is the frequency of asymptomatic infection? How does the immune response in children compare with that in adults? Does vertical transmission occur? What about infection in neonates and in pregnant women, and what impact might that have on outcome of the pregnancy? Clearly there's the need for household transmission studies. Why the disconnect between travel patterns and number of SARS introductions? The comment was made about Shanghai being relatively spared in this epidemic, in spite of the fact that apparently there's quite a bit of travel between Guangdong province and Shanghai. Why has there not been more disease there? What about and what about India and other countries that you can think of. There's a need for more work with animal models. The question was raised in terms of seasonality as the seasons change, and then a return to issues related to the role of diarrhea, ever-present. And then finally, moving into the infection control arena, the point that was made this morning about quarantine and the issue of self-isolation, which has been practiced in a number of countries, including Canada. What's the sociology? What's the practicality? What sort of incentives might work in that setting? We need to know more about the relative timing of infectivity as well as shedding of the virus, and clearly more work needs to be done on environmental stability of the virus. Now, to wind down, but before we do, turning to the question of is the research infrastructure adequate, there was general agreement in the group that we all need to work hard to improve collaborations in support of China, both in country and by bringing Chinese scientists to other countries to work on these issues. And clearly there's some issues related to trust that need to be acknowledged, addressed, and overcome. Is there a role for collaboration, I think is how the question was phrased. Clearly there is. There's a need for much more open communication. The group acknowledged WHO for their outstanding role in bringing investigators around the world, both on the clinical side, the epidemiologic side, and the laboratory side together almost from day one to share information in real time. But clearly there are barriers to collaborative research. They need to be identified, recognized, and overcome. They differ somewhat in the emergency setting from the long-term setting. And then finally, to close, the group felt that there was a need to identify and support existing collaborations that can be leveraged here as we work to address SARS, augment the existing infrastructure. One of the individuals in the group actually made reference to the U.S.-Japan Cooperative Medical Science panel as perhaps a model for what could be done in the future. The Fogarty opportunities were acknowledged, and then finally CIPRA and the China HIV collaboration. So let me stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim. Are there any questions for Dr. Hughes? Gail?
Just quickly, as a participant in the U.S.-Japan model, I would highly endorse that because I think it's worked very well over a period of 30 years. Secondly,
the gentleman
Jim,
to your left was the perpetrator.
I suspected that there might be a few of us here. But the other thing is Bob Couch brought up the topic of pneumonia this morning, and in your list of potential co-infection agents, including chlamydia pneumoniae and the metapneumonia virus, I think pneumonia is equally likely because at least in well-documented studies, as many as 50% of cases in children of community-acquired pneumonia can be due to pneumonia, and in hospitalized adults, using, again, well-documented diagnostics, as many as 10 to 25% of cases can be shown to be due to pneumonia and can be associated with ARDS.
Agree. Thank you. The other point is that there's an awful lot of community-acquired pneumonia that occurs for which we have no identifiable etiology. So there are clearly other agents out there.
Thank you, Jim. Let's go to the last group, which is diagnostics, and let me ask Jim LeDuc to give a report.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Well, I'm really embarrassed that all of my predecessors have had these eloquent presentations. I'm afraid we were more focused on our discussion and less on the documentation thereof. At any rate, we had a very great dialogue. We had a a number of representatives from academic centers, industry, government agencies, and a lot of international participation. My co-chair was Dr. Malik Perez, and we were assisted by Dr. Park as rapporteur. We opened with a presentation from Bill Bellini, who gave us an overview of the current status of diagnostic capacities, focused initially on the importance of classical virology and the original recognition of SARS virus, the importance of EM in its identification. Moved on then to serological assays currently available, both the ELISAs and the IFA test, and then to PCR, commenting on the PCR exquisite sensitivity and the risk of false positive reactions that we're all very much aware of. We also heard from a colleague, GenBank, mentioning that there are 16 folding sequences now available in GenBank, so the sequence database is quite available. And we also commented that CDC has made a number of reagents available, virus, inactivated antigen, and nucleic acids to nearly 200 partners, both in academic centers and in industry. I think you'll see there's been a nice complementarity between the recommendations that we came up with from the diagnostic perspective as compared to those that were made from the clinical group, especially recognizing the pathogenesis of the disease and the need for documentation of diagnostic targets throughout the course of the illness. I think there was general agreement that we required well-documented, well-pedigreed specimens for development of future diagnostic assays. This includes blood or serum, respiratory specimens, sputum, things like that, stool and urine, and also pathological specimens. We had a very nice complimentary brief presentation from David Feichel of FDA, who commented on the requirements for the regulatory requirements for diagnostic test development, and especially in the context of a new disease where specimen access is going to be a critical challenge to us. So that I'd like to personally thank the folks from FDA that stayed throughout and really did complement the dialogue very nicely. There was also recognition, as we've heard this morning, that this virus or group of viruses is known to mutate, so it was important to maintain sequence information in an RNA database that represents geographic and temporal isolates. Clearly, the need for reagents is fundamental for diagnostic test development. We were concerned about the availability of both monoclonal and polyclonal antiserum and expressed antigens. There was discussion of where to put these so that they are maximally available, and the suggestion was made that we, in order to be successful, we have to have really global participation. We need to be drawing upon the experiences of the countries now experiencing outbreaks and making sure that this material is put into repositories that can be accessed by all comers. The suggestion was made that this could be jointly managed, perhaps between WHO, the NIH, recognizing NIH's initiative on bioterrorism availability and the fact that they will already be making a repository for some reagents, but this could nicely fold into that, and drawing on the experiences of CDC already, and probably others as well. As others have said, international collaboration is clearly an important component of all of this. It's also a changing field, so that any information and material needs to be updated frequently so that the most current available material is widely shared. There was recognition, as we've heard earlier, for the need both for additional sequencing of SARS viruses as the epidemic continues, and for non-SARS viruses, so that we have a solid database of coronavirus genomics that we can refer back to. As others have said, we recognize the need for animal models. This will be a very good source for generation of diagnostic test material, and also an opportunity to validate diagnostic tests that are under development. It will also be a useful source for pathological specimens and so on. We recognize that it won't be long at all before we're in the middle of respiratory disease season, and that the question is going to be posed, how do we differentiate this very serious SARS illness from the common cold and other diseases that are circulating at that time? So we need to be thinking in terms of multiplex diagnostics, ways that we can rapidly differentiate SARS cases and isolate those individuals from the run-of-the-mill respiratory infections that may be in circulation. I told you it was short. We also had a nice discussion of some of the new technologies, some microarray chip analysis, things such as this, and I think this clearly is going to be a solid potential for us in the future as well. So I think with that, let me close and maybe answer any questions.
Any questions of Jim? If not, I wanted to take the opportunity to once again thank you all for your participation in this most extraordinary and successful meeting. I want to take the opportunity to again thank John LaMontagne and people in my office, in the Institute, and the different divisions who I think did an extraordinary job in putting this meeting together. Thank you, John. I might bring to your attention that the summaries that you've just heard will be on our website, on the NIID website, for the next several days. Actually, the slides will be, and the summaries themselves, and we hope to get it published in the Journal of Infectious Diseases. So you will have the opportunity to see formally these materials for some time to come, and we recommend to you that you access the website and take a look at them. So if there are any further questions, thank you for coming and have a safe trip home. Thank you very much.